The morning air in Lekeitio had a particular weight to it, a damp coolness that settled on the skin and remained there until the sun decided to climb high enough over the hills to burn it away. On this morning the sun was not in any hurry, and the fog that had rolled in from the Bay of Bisque during the night still clung to the stone ramps and the wooden pilings of the harbour. You could taste the salt on your lips before you even reached the water's edge. A fine mist carried on the breeze that smelled of damp wool and old fish, and the deep mineral scent of the stones themselves. The dock was a wide platform of grey stone, worn smooth by generations of bare feet and wooden shoes, and the dragging of heavy barrels. It sloped gently down toward the water, where a handful of small fishing boats bobbed lazily, their masts bare, and their nets piled in wet heaps. The tide was just beginning to turn, and the sound it made was not a crash or a roar, but a soft, persistent sucking noise against the barnacle-covered steps, a quiet whisper of water retreating from the mud and the rock. It was a sound so constant and so familiar that it had become a kind of silence in itself, a background hum that the mind no longer registered unless it stopped altogether. Beneath a low overhang of red clay tiles, a wooden table stood on 4 thick legs, its surface dark with the oil of 10,000 fish and bleached in patches by the scrubbing of coarse salt. Next to the table rested a barrel made of oak staves, bound with iron hoops that had rusted to a deep flaky brown, the colour of autumn leaves left in the rain. The barrel was half full of brine from the previous day's work, a liquid the colour of weak tea and thick with dissolved salt and the faint milky residue of cod flesh. Beside the barrel was a smaller wooden bucket heaped with coarse grey sea salt that sparkled faintly in the diffuse morning light, the individual crystals catching the moisture in the air and beginning to clump together in tiny fragile clusters. The woman who worked at this table had been coming here since she was tall enough to see over its edge, and her hands knew the feel of the wood better than they knew the feel of her own bed sheets. She wore a dress of heavy brown wool that fell past her ankles, and a linen cap that covered her hair and kept the stray scales from settling there. Over the dress she tied a burlap apron that was stiff with salt and fish oil and the dried residue of 100 mornings just like this one. The apron made a soft scraping sound when she moved, a sound like a broom being drawn slowly over a stone floor. She placed her palms flat on the table and felt the familiar grit under her skin, the tiny indentations where the knife had scored the wood over the years. She looked out over the water toward the mouth of the harbour where the fog was thickest, a pale grey wall that obscured the line between sea and sky. There was nothing to see out there except the same greyness she had seen yesterday and the day before and the day before that. The view was not a source of contemplation or wonder. It was simply the backdrop to the work that needed to be done. The first task of the morning was always the same. She reached into the barrel of brine and lifted out one of the heavy grey stones that sat on top of the wooden lid beneath. The stone was cold and wet and covered in a fine slippery film of algae from its long immersion. She set it down on the stone ramp with a dull thud that did not echo because the fog absorbed sound the way a heavy blanket absorbs warmth. She lifted the second stone and set it beside the first, then the third and the fourth, each one placed in the exact same spot where they sat every morning, forming a small damp circle on the ground. With the stones removed, she grasped the edges of the round wooden lid that floated just beneath the surface of the brine. She pulled it free and leaned it against the side of the barrel, letting the excess liquid drip back down into the cask. The smell that rose from the open barrel was the smell of the sea concentrated and transformed, a clean, sharp saltiness overlaid with the faint, sweet undertone of fish, beginning its slow transformation into preserved food. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of winter meals and long voyages and the quiet satisfaction of a task completed. She looked down into the brine. The split cod from the previous day lay in neat overlapping layers beneath the cloudy surface, their flesh having already begun to firm and whiten from the action of the salt. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, losing their water and taking in the salt, their cells collapsing and reforming into something that would last for months or years without spoiling. It was a slow, invisible process that required no intervention from her beyond the initial arrangement and the weight of the stones. It was a kind of patience that the fish demanded and that the woman had learned long ago. Satisfied that nothing was amiss, that the brine level was still high enough to cover the topmost layer of fish, she reached for a smaller wooden bucket and a ladle carved from a single piece of beechwood. The ladle was smooth and dark from use. Its bowl stained the color of strong tea. She scooped some of the brine from the barrel and poured it into the bucket, a small amount, just enough to wet the wooden tabletop, before she began the day's cutting. This was a ritual performed without thought, a step so ingrained that her hands moved while her eyes drifted back to the fog. She tipped the bucket and let the brine spread across the wood in a thin, glistening sheet. Then she took a handful of the coarse grey salt from the pile and scattered it over the wet surface. She placed the flat of her palm against the table and began to scrub in slow, methodical circles, working the salt into the grain of the wood. The salt crunched and rasped against the surface, a sound like walking on a path of crushed seashells. The motion was repetitive, and even her shoulder moving in a steady rhythm, while her other hand rested on the edge of the table, steadying her weight. She scrubbed until the wood felt clean and slightly rough under her fingers, the dried fish oils from yesterday loosened and carried away by the abrasive salt. Then she scooped another bucket of fresh seawater from the harbor, using a rope tied to its handle, and she poured it over the table to rinse away the dirty salt. The water ran off the edges and splashed onto the stone ramp, where it joined the other small rivulets that trickled down toward the sea. She dried the table with a rag made from an old sailcloth that had once been part of a boat called the Santa Ana. The cloth was bleached by sun and salt and frayed at the edges, but it absorbed water well enough. She wiped the wood until it was merely damp, leaving behind the faintest sheen of moisture that would evaporate in its own time. Now the table was ready. The wood had been washed and scrubbed and rinsed and dried, just as it had been every morning since the first day she was old enough to help her own mother with this same task. The barrel was open and inspected. The salt was piled and waiting. The stones were on the ground. The fog was still there, a soft grey presence that muted the colours of the village and made the red tile roofs look like they had been dusted with ash. She walked back up the ramp a short distance to where a large wicker basket sat covered with a wet piece of linen. The basket was heavy, and the wicker creaked when she bent to lift it by its two rope handles. She carried it back to the table and set it down with a grunt that was more breath than sound. Inside the basket lay the catch from the night before, a dozen large cod, their silver and olive speckled skins still shining with a faint slime, their round eyes staring at nothing in particular. They had been caught hours ago by the boats that had gone out in the dark, and they had been lying in this basket ever since, their bodies slowly cooling to the temperature of the morning air. She reached into the basket and grasped the first fish by its gills. It was cold and firm and surprisingly heavy. She laid it flat on the clean wooden table, with its head pointing to her left and its tail to her right. She ran her hand along its flank, feeling the smooth scales and the slight bump of the lateral line that ran from gill to tail, a faint ridge that helped the fish sense movement in the water when it was still alive. She felt the firmness of the flesh beneath the skin, testing it with her thumb, the way a baker tests dough. It was a good fish. It had been caught recently and kept cool, and it would take the salt well. Beside the table, on a small ledge of stone, sat the filleting knife. It was a simple tool with a broad blade of carbon steel that was stained a permanent grey from years of contact with fish blood and salt water and the oils from her own hands. The wooden handle was worn smooth and fitted perfectly into the curve of her right palm. She picked it up and felt the familiar weight of it, the balance point just behind the first rivet. She did not need to look at the knife. Her hand simply closed around it the way a hand closes around a doorknob. She placed the tip of the blade just behind the fish's gill plate and made a short, clean cut, angling the knife toward the head. There was a soft crunch as the blade found the joint of the spine, a sound that was not loud or dramatic, but simply present. She turned the knife and drew it along the back of the fish from head to tail in one long, smooth motion, separating the fillet of meat from the central bone structure. The blade moved through the flesh with very little resistance, parting the white meat from the ribs with a quiet, wet whisper. She flipped the fish over and repeated the motion on the other side, producing a second fillet that mirrored the first. The two fillets lay side by side on the table, their flesh a translucent pearly white, tinged with pink near the center where the bloodline ran. The skeleton of the fish remained attached to the head and tail, a delicate cage of fine bones and the long segmented spine. She cut the head and skeleton away from the tail with another quick stroke and placed the remains into a separate clay pot that sat on the ground near her feet. The gulls would get the contents of that pot later after the day's work was done, and they knew this. They were already beginning to gather on the roof of the net shed across the harbour, their white bodies emerging from the fog like ghosts. She took the 2 fillets and laid them skin side down on the table. Using the edge of the knife, she scraped away the fine membrane of bloodline that ran along the center of each piece, a thin dark ribbon that would affect the taste of the preserved fish if left in place. The motion was gentle and precise, the blade angled almost flat against the flesh. When she was finished, the fillets were a uniform pale cream color, ready to receive the salt. She reached into the barrel and scooped up a handful of the coarse grey salt. She held her hand over the first fillet and began to sprinkle the salt in a slow, steady rain, letting the crystals fall evenly across the surface. The salt made a soft pattering sound as it hit the wet flesh, a sound like the first few drops of rain on a dusty road. She rubbed the salt into the meat, with her fingertips working it into every crevice and along the edges where the flesh was thinnest. She turned the fillet over and repeated the process on the skin side, although the salt did not stick as well to the smooth scales. When both fillets were thoroughly coated, she lifted them one at a time and placed them carefully into the barrel, arranging them on top of the older fish from the previous day. She laid them flat, pressing down gently with her palms to ensure they made good contact with the brine below. The new fish floated slightly buoyed by their own freshness, but soon they would sink as the salt drew out their water and they became denser than the liquid around them. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the basket. There were 11 more fish to go. The fog had lightened slightly, becoming more of a pale haze than a solid wall, but the sun was still only a vague brightness behind the clouds somewhere over the hills. The tide had turned fully now, and the water in the harbour was beginning its slow, steady crawl back up the stone steps and over the mud flats, a process that would take many hours and that would go entirely unnoticed by anyone except the crabs and the small fish that darted in the shallows. She reached for the next cod and laid it on the table. Her hands moved in the same sequence: the cut behind the gills, the long draw of the blade along the spine, the flip of the fish, the second cut, the removal of the skeleton to the clay pot, the scraping of the bloodline, the handful of salt, the slow, careful sprinkling, the rubbing of the crystals into the flesh, the placement into the barrel, the press of the palms to settle the fillet. She did this again and again. Each fish was slightly different from the one before. This one was a little longer, its flesh a bit softer. That one had a scar on its flank, a pale line where a net had cut into its side weeks or months ago. Another had a darker speckled pattern on its skin, a variation that meant nothing but was simply there. The differences were noted in a quiet part of her mind, the same way she noted the shifting shape of the fog or the changing sound of the water lapping against the dock. They were not important. They were simply details of the day. The sun eventually broke through the haze and a pale watery light spilled across the harbour, turning the grey water to a dull silver and casting soft shadows behind the barrels and the table and the woman herself. The warmth of the sun on her shoulders was a welcome sensation after the chill of the morning fog, and she paused for a moment to tilt her face toward the sky, feeling the heat on her cheeks. Then she bent back to the table and continued her work. The pile of salt in the bucket grew smaller. The pile of salt in the bucket grew smaller. The level of fish in the basket grew smaller. The level of fish in the basket grew smaller. The level of fish in the barrel rose slowly, one fillet at a time. The sound of the knife on the bone and the salt on the wood became a quiet rhythm that matched the slow breathing of the tide and the distant cry of the gulls that were growing impatient on the rooftop. It was a rhythm that asked nothing of the listener except patience and a willingness to let the minutes pass without counting them. When the last fish had been cut and salted and placed into the barrel, she straightened her back and pressed her hands against her lower spine, stretching the muscles that had been bent over the table for so long. She looked into the barrel and saw the new layers of pale fillets resting just beneath the surface of the brine, their edges already beginning to curl slightly from the action of the salt. She reached for the round wooden lid and lowered it back onto the fish, pushing it down until it was fully submerged. Then she lifted the heavy grey stones one by one and placed them back on top of the lid, their familiar weight settling into the same positions they had occupied the day before and the day before that. She took the clay pot full of fish heads and skeletons and carried it down to the water's edge where the gulls were already circling. She emptied the pot onto the wet stones and stepped back. The birds descended in a flurry of white wings and raucous cries, a sudden burst of noise and motion that lasted only a few seconds before they settled into their own quiet routine of picking and squabbling and flying away with their prizes. She watched them for a moment, her hands resting on her hips, and then she turned and walked back to the table. She rinsed the knife in the bucket of seawater and dried it carefully on the old sailcloth. She placed it back on the stone ledge where it would wait for tomorrow. She scrubbed the table one last time with salt and seawater until the wood was clean and bare, and then she covered the barrel with a piece of heavy canvas that was stiff with dried salt and secured the corners with small stones. The canvas flapped once in the breeze and then settled into stillness. The morning's work was finished. The dock was quiet again except for the constant whisper of the tide and the soft cries of the gulls. The fog had burned away completely now, and the village of Lekeitio was visible across the harbour, its whitewashed walls and red tile roofs glowing softly in the midday light. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, thin grey columns that leaned inland with the breeze. She stood for a while looking at nothing in particular, her hands resting on the edge of the table, feeling the familiar grain of the wood under her fingertips. The salt had dried on her skin, leaving a fine white powder in the creases of her knuckles and around her fingernails. She rubbed her hands together slowly, feeling the gritty texture, and then brushed them off on her apron. She would come back tomorrow. The fish would come back tomorrow. The fish would come back tomorrow. The salt and the knife and the barrel and the stones would all be waiting exactly where she had left them. The fog might return, or it might not. The tide would come in and go out. The gulls would circle and cry, and she would stand at this same table with the same knife in her hand, and she would do the same work in the same quiet, unhurried way, because that was what the day asked of her, and that was what she knew how to give. The knife that rested on the stone ledge beside the wooden table had been forged in a small smithy in the hills above Guernica, a place where the sound of hammer on anvil was as constant as the sound of sheep bells on the slopes. The blade was made of simple carbon steel, a material that took an edge easily and held it well, but that also stained and darkened with every contact it made with salt water and fish blood and the oils of human skin. After years of use, the steel was no longer silver or grey, but a deep mottled charcoal colour, marked with faint swirls and streaks that looked like the grain of old wood or the surface of a slow-moving river, seen from a great height. The blade was broad near the handle, tapering to a fine point at the tip, and it curved upward just slightly, a gentle arc that followed the natural contour of a cod's spine. The handle was made of boxwood, a dense pale wood that had come from a tree that grew somewhere far to the south where the winters were shorter and the sun was stronger. The wood had been turned on a lathe and shaped to fit comfortably in the hand, with a slight swelling in the middle that filled the palm and a narrower section near the blade where the thumb and forefinger could grit with precision. The surface of the handle had once been smooth and polished, but decades of use had worn it down to a soft and matte finish, marked by countless tiny indentations, where salt crystals had pressed into the fibers, and by a darker stain near the bolster, where fish oil had seeped into the grain, and never fully come out. The handle was held to the tang of the blade by 3 brass rivets that had dulled to the colour of dried mustard and that sat flush with the surface of the wood, having been worn down by the constant pressure of a working hand. When the woman picked up the knife, her fingers found their places, without any conscious direction from her mind. The pad of her thumb rested against the flat of the blade just above the bolster, a position that gave her control over the angle of the cut. Her forefinger curled around the top of the handle while her remaining 3 fingers wrapped around the lower swell, gripping firmly but without tension. The heel of her palm pressed against the butt of the handle, and the weight of the knife was distributed evenly across her hand, so that it felt less like holding a tool and more like an extension of her arm. She had held this knife in this same way for so many years that the bones of her hand had developed a slight asymmetry, a faint thickening of the knuckle on the index finger and a small callus at the base of the thumb where the wood rubbed against the skin. The first cut of the day was always the same. She placed a fresh cod on the clean, damp table, with its head pointing to her left and its belly facing away from her body. She placed her left hand flat on the fish's head, pressing down firmly to hold it in place, her fingers spread wide over the slippery scales. With the knife in her right hand, she brought the tip of the blade to rest just behind the gill plate, at the point where the hard bony structure of the head met the softer flesh of the body. This was the joint, the natural seam, where the spine connected to the skull, and as she placed the knife correctly, the blade would find its way through with very little effort. She angled the blade slightly downward, tipping her wrist so that the cutting edge pointed toward the backbone rather than straight through the flesh. This angle was important. If the knife was held too flat, it would slide across the ribs and fail to separate the fillet cleanly. If it was held too steeply, it would cut into the bone and dull the edge unnecessarily. The correct angle was something she knew without thinking, the same way she knew how much pressure to apply when kneading bread or how far to lean when walking up the steep stone ramp on a rainy day. Her wrist flexed just so, and the blade slid into the gap behind the gills with a soft crunch that was more felt through the handle than heard through the air. She drew the knife toward herself in a single long motion, moving from the head toward the tail. The blade traveled along the length of the spine, cutting through the thin translucent flesh that connected the meat to the ribs. The sound it made was a quiet, wet whisper, a sound like a page being turned very slowly in a book whose pages had been dampened by the sea air. The knife moved steadily, without hesitation and without haste, at a speed that matched the rhythm of her breathing. She did not saw back and forth. She simply pulled the blade through, letting its sharpness do the work. The fillet of meat peeled away from the bone as she cut, revealing the white flesh beneath and the delicate fan of the rib bones that remained attached to the spine. When the blade reached the tail, she did not cut all the way through. She left a small hinge of skin connecting the fillet to the tail so that the piece of fish would not fall away and slide off the table onto the stone floor. This was a habit born of practicality and repeated so often that it had become part of the physical memory of the task. She lifted the knife and set it down for a moment while she used both hands to flick the fish over so that its other side now faced upward. The fish made a soft, wet sound as it turned, a sound like a boot being pulled from thick mud. She picked up the knife again and repeated the motion on the second side. The tip of the blade found the same spot behind the gills. Her wrist angled the same way. The knife traveled along the spine in the same steady, unhurried pull. This side was always slightly easier because the fish now lay flat against the table with the cut surface down, giving it more stability and reducing the chance that it would slide around under her hands. The second fillet separated from the backbone with the same quiet whisper, and when the knife reached the tail, she left the same small hinge of skin attaching it to the tail fin. With both fillets now cut free, but still attached at the tail, she set the knife down again and grasped the head of the fish with her left hand and the tail with her right. She lifted the entire fish slightly off the table and gave a short, firm pull. The head and the attached skeleton separated from the two fillets with a sound like a green stick being broken, a sound that was crisp and brief. The spine came away cleanly, trailing the fine rib bones and the delicate translucent membrane that had once held the organs in place. She placed the head and skeleton into the clay pot at her feet, where it landed with a soft, wet thump on top of the other remains from the morning's work. The two fillets lay side by side on the table, skin side down, their flesh a pale pearly white that was almost translucent at the edges. She ran her thumb along the center of each fillet, feeling for the bloodline that ran the length of the fish, a narrow dark red stripe of muscle tissue that was denser and oilier than the surrounding white meat. The bloodline would not take the salt in the same way that the white flesh did, and if it was left in place, it would turn brown and strong-tasting during the preservation process. Removing it was a small task, but an important one. She picked up the knife again and turned it in her hand so that she held it at a flatter angle, the blade almost parallel to the surface of the table. She placed the cutting edge against the bloodline at the head end of the first fillet and drew the blade toward herself with a gentle scraping motion. The dark tissue peeled away in a thin ribbon, curling up behind the knife like a wood shaving from a carpenter's plane. She scraped from head to tail in one continuous stroke, then lifted the ribbon of dark flesh and dropped it into the clay pot with the skeletons. She repeated the motion on the second fillet, and when she was finished, the flesh was a uniform pale cream color from end to end, ready for the salt. The knife required care even during the work. Fish flesh and salt and moisture would build up on the blade after a few cuts, creating a thin film that made the knife slip and drag rather than glide. She kept a small bucket of seawater near her feet, and every few fish she would dip the blade into the water and wipe it dry on the edge of her apron. The water in the bucket grew cloudier as the morning progressed, taking on a faint milky tint from the dissolved proteins and the tiny particles of flesh that washed off the steel. She would empty this bucket into the harbor when the day was done and fill it fresh the next morning, a small ritual of cleaning that marked the boundary between one day's labor and the next. The position of her body during this work was as unchanging as the position of her hands. She stood with her feet shoulder-width apart, her weight balanced evenly between both legs. Her hips pressed lightly against the edge of the table, not leaning heavily, but using the contact to steady herself during the cutting motions. Her back was straight but not rigid, with a slight forward tilt to the waist that brought her eyes closer to the work, without straining her neck. This posture had developed over many years, and it allowed her to work for hours without the deep ache that would come from hunching or stooping. The muscles of her shoulders and upper back moved in a slow, continuous rhythm as she reached for each fish, cut it, scraped it, salted it, and placed it in the barrel. The motion was repetitive but not mechanical, because each fish was slightly different and required small adjustments of pressure and angle and speed. Some fish were longer than others, and the knife had to travel a greater distance from gill to tail. These fish required a slightly longer breath, a slightly longer pull of the arm. Other fish were thicker through the shoulder, and the blade met more resistance as it cut through the dense flesh near the head. With these, she had to apply a bit more pressure, leaning her weight into the cut just slightly. Some fish had been caught in the net and had bruising along their flanks where the flesh was softer and darker, and these areas cut differently, almost like cutting through wet paper rather than firm meat. She noted these variations without comment, adjusting her technique in small ways that were invisible to anyone watching, but that her hands understood completely. The sound of the knife on the bone was a sound she had heard so many times that it no longer registered as a distinct noise. It was simply part of the texture of the morning, along with the cry of the gulls and the whisper of the tide and the occasional creak of a boat rubbing against its mooring. The sound was not loud or jarring. It was a soft, brief crunch that lasted only a fraction of a second, and then was gone, replaced by the quiet slide of the blade through the flesh. If someone had asked her to describe a sound, she might have compared it to the noise of stepping on a dried leaf, or biting into a crisp apple. But she had never been asked, and she had never thought to describe it. The sound simply existed, and then it did not. And then it existed again, with the next fish. The clay pot at her feet filled slowly over the course of the morning. Each fish contributed one head, one spine, one set of ribs, and 2 thin ribbons of bloodline. The pot was wide and shallow, made of unglazed red earthenware that had been fired in a kiln somewhere in the hills, and that had a rough, gritty texture on the outside and a smoother, darker surface on the inside. By the time the basket of fresh cod was half empty, the pot was half full, and the smell that rose from it was the clean, sharp smell of raw fish and seawater. A smell that was not unpleasant, but that attracted the attention of the gulls that circled overhead. The gulls of Lekeitio were large birds with grey wings and white bodies and yellow beaks with a small red spot on the lower mandible. They knew the routine of the dock as well as the woman did. They knew that the clay pot would be filled during the morning, and at some time after the sun reached its highest point, it would be carried down to the water's edge and emptied onto the stones. They did not rush or clamour while she worked. They simply waited, perched on the red tile roofs and the wooden pilings and the stone wall that separated the harbour from the narrow street that led up into the village. Occasionally one would let out a long, harsh cry that echoed off the stone walls and faded into the fog or the sunlight. But mostly they were silent, patient watchers whose yellow eyes followed her every movement. The knife grew warm in her hand from the heat of her palm. The boxwood handle absorbed this warmth and held it so that the wood felt almost alive against her skin. In the winter months, when the morning air was cold enough to make her breath visible, the warmth of the handle was a small comfort, a tiny pocket of heat in an otherwise chilly world. In the summer, when the sun beat down on the stone dock and the air shimmered with heat, the handle grew warm more quickly, and sometimes became almost hot to the touch, but never so hot that she could not hold it. The wood was a good conductor of heat, but not an excessive one, and it released its warmth slowly into the cooler air when she set it down. She thought about the knife sometimes in a vague, unfocused way. She thought about the blacksmith who had made it, a man whose name she did not know, and whose face she had never seen. She thought about the tree that had provided the wood for the handle, a tree that had grown for many decades in a place she would never visit, and that had been cut down and shaped by hands she would never shake. She thought about the fish that the knife had cut over the years, thousands and thousands of fish, each one passing under this same blade, in this same way. The thoughts did not lead anywhere. They were simply passing notions that drifted through her mind, like the fog drifting through the harbor, and then they were gone, replaced by the immediate physical reality of the work. The angle of the blade, the position of the thumb, the pressure of the palm, the rhythm of the pull. These were the things that filled her attention, not as conscious decisions, but as a state of being. She was not thinking about the knife, she was holding it. She was not planning the cut, she was making it. There was a kind of peace in this, a quiet stillness at the center of the repetitive motion that asked nothing of her except to continue. The world beyond the table, the world of distant shipyards and great fleets and the names of kings and queens that people spoke of in the village square, had no presence here. Here there was only the wood and the steel and the fish and the salt and the slow, steady work of hands that knew exactly what to do. When the last fish had been cut and scraped and salted, she set the knife down on the stone ledge and looked at it. The blade was smeared with a thin film of fish oil and tiny flecks of white flesh. The handle bore the fresh marks of her grip, the faint impression of her fingers in the worn wood. She would clean it soon, but for a moment it simply lay there, catching the pale light that filtered through the haze, a tool at rest, a partner in the quiet labor of the morning. She lifted the clay pot by its two small handles and carried it down the ramp toward the water. The gulls stirred on their perches, watching her progress with keen attention. She reached the spot where the stone steps descended into the harbor, and she tipped the pot forward, letting the contents slide out onto the wet rocks. The heads and skeletons tumbled over each other and came to rest in a glistening pile, the empty eye sockets staring up at the sky. She stepped back, and the gulls descended their wings, making a soft whooshing sound as they landed and began their own work of picking and pulling and carrying away. The noise of their cries was loud for a moment, and then it settled into a lower murmur, a background sound that would continue until the pile was gone and the rocks were bare again. She walked back to the table and poured fresh seawater from the bucket over the knife blade, watching the water sheet off the steel and carry away the residue of the morning. She wiped the blade dry with the corner of her apron, and then wiped the handle too, removing the salt and the oil that had accumulated there. She placed the knife back on the stone ledge, aligning it carefully so that it would not roll or slip. It would wait there in the same position until tomorrow morning, when her hand would find it again, and the first cut would be made, and the quiet rhythm would resume. The barrel stood on the stone dock, like a patient sentinel, its oak staves darkened by years of brine and weather to a color that was not quite brown and not quite gray, but something in between, like the bark of an old tree that has stood through many winters. The iron hoops that held the staves together were 3 in number, spaced evenly along the height of the barrel, and each one had rusted to a deep flaking orange-brown, with patches of black where the moisture had pooled and sat undisturbed. The hoops were not decorative. They were essential, applying the constant inward pressure that kept the wooden staves tight against one another and prevented the brine from seeping out through the gaps. This pressure was a quiet thing, invisible and uncelebrated, but without it the barrel would be nothing more than a collection of curved wooden planks lying in a heap on the ground. The woman approached the barrel after the morning fog had lifted and the table had been scrubbed clean of yesterday's residue. She carried a fresh bucket of coarse sea salt in her left hand, the weight of it pulling her shoulder down slightly, the handle digging a red line into her palm. The salt was not the fine white powder that might sit in a small dish on a dining table in a distant city. It was a rough grey, crystalline substance harvested from the salt pans further down the coast, where the shallow seawater was trapped behind low stone walls and allowed to evaporate under the sun, until only the minerals remained. Each crystal was irregular in shape and size, some as small as grains of sand and others as large as the tip of a child's smallest finger. They sparkled faintly even in the muted light of the overcast morning, catching the pale grey of the sky and reflecting it back in tiny fractured glints. She set the bucket down beside the barrel and looked inside the cask. It was empty now, having been scrubbed out the previous evening with a stiff brush made of boar bristles and rinsed with several buckets of clean seawater. The interior of the barrel was smooth and dark, and damp smelling of oak and salt, and the faint ghost of fish that had been preserved within its walls over many years. The bottom of the barrel was slightly concave, sloping gently toward the center, where a small depression collected whatever liquid might settle there. This was by design, a subtle curve in the wood that helped the brine distribute itself evenly when the time came. The first layer of any barrel of salted cod was not fish but salt itself. A bed of pure salt had to be laid down on the bare wood, a foundation that would draw moisture from the bottom of the lowest fillet and prevent the flesh from sticking to the wood and spoiling. The woman reached into the bucket and scooped up a generous handful of the grey crystals, letting them fall from her fingers in a slow cascade to gauge their size and texture. Some of the salt clumped together in small fragile clusters held by the ambient moisture in the air, and she crushed these between her thumb and forefinger, feeling the brittle resistance give way to a fine grit. She did this without hurry, her hands moving in a rhythm that was as natural to her as breathing. She began to sprinkle the salt into the empty barrel. Her hand moved back and forth over the bottom of the cask in a steady, deliberate pattern, releasing a thin, even rain of crystals that pattered softly against the wood. The sound was a gentle hissing whisper, like the first drops of rain on a roof made of clay tiles, a sound that invited stillness and patience. She covered the entire bottom surface of the barrel with a layer of salt, approximately the thickness of her smallest finger, ensuring that no patch of bare wood remained visible. The salt crunched quietly under her palm when she pressed down to settle it, a sound like walking on a path of crushed seashells after a high tide. Salt was a simple thing in appearance, but its nature was a quiet miracle that had been known to people along this coast for longer than anyone could remember. When salt touched the flesh of a fish, it began to draw the water out of the cells through a process that did not require any effort or attention from the person who had applied it. The salt dissolved slowly into the moisture that seeped from the fish, creating a concentrated brine that was heavier than plain seawater and hostile to the tiny invisible organisms that caused flesh to rot and spoil. In this way the fish was preserved, not by cooking or freezing or drying alone, but by a gentle chemical exchange that transformed the very nature of the meat, turning it from something perishable and soft into something durable and firm that could last for months in the hold of a ship or the corner of a pantry. The woman did not think about this process in scientific terms. She simply knew that if she put enough salt on the fish and left it alone under the weight of the stones, it would be good to eat when the winter came and the boats could not go out. With the bed of salt in place, she turned her attention to the basket of fresh cod that sat on the dock beside the table. The fish had been brought in by the boats before dawn, their bodies still cool from the deep water, and their scales still slick with the slime that protected them while they swam. She lifted the first split fillet from the pile where she had placed it, after cutting, and carried it carefully to the barrel. The fillet was long and pale, its flesh a translucent white with a faint pinkish blush along the center line where the bloodline had been scraped away. It was still wet to the touch and slightly springy when she pressed her finger into the thickest part of the meat. She laid the fillet gently onto the bed of salt in the bottom of the barrel, positioning it so that it lay flat and straight with its skin side facing down. The skin was a mottled pattern of olive green and silver grey, with a fine dusting of salt crystals already clinging to its surface. She pressed the fillet down firmly with her palms, feeling the salt crunch beneath the weight of the fish and the slight give of the flesh as it settled into place. The fillet was now resting on a cushion of salt that would begin immediately to draw out its moisture, the water from the fish meeting the salt, and beginning the slow, quiet work of preservation. She reached for a second fillet and laid it beside the first, overlapping it slightly, so that the thicker head end of one fillet nestled against the thinner tail end of the other. This arrangement was not random. It was a careful fitting together of shapes designed to make the most efficient use of the limited space within the circular barrel. The two fillets lay side by side like tiles on a roof, each one supporting and being supported by the ones around it. She pressed them both down, firmly smoothing out any air pockets that might trap moisture and cause uneven curing. Now she took another handful of salt and began to sprinkle it over the top of the first two fillets. The salt fell in a fine, even curtain, covering the pale flesh with a new layer of grey-white crystals that sparkled faintly in the dim light. She made sure to cover the edges especially well because the edges were where the flesh was thinnest and most vulnerable to spoilage. The salt piled up slightly along the sides of the fillets, creating small drifts and ridges that would slowly dissolve into the brine as the hours passed. She placed a third fillet on top of the first two, arranging it at a slight angle so that it crossed them like the spokes of a wagon wheel. This crosswise layering helped to distribute the weight evenly and prevented the fillets from sliding around when the brine eventually formed and the fish began to float. She pressed this third fillet down and covered it with another generous layer of salt, the crystals falling with that same soft hissing whisper against the wet flesh. The barrel was beginning to fill slowly, one fish at a time, one handful of salt at a time. The process continued in this same quiet rhythm. A layer of fish arranged flat and pressed down. A layer of salt sprinkled evenly and rubbed gently into any crevices. Another layer of fish arranged at a slightly different angle. More salt. More pressing. The woman's hands moved with a calm precision that came from years of repetition, her mind not focused on the task in any urgent way but simply present in the doing of it. The smell of the fish and the salt mingled together in the cool air, a clean, sharp scent that was the smell of the sea itself, concentrated and contained within the oaken walls of the barrel. She paused occasionally to brush a stray strand of hair away from her face or to wipe the salt dust from her eyes with the back of her wrist. The salt was everywhere now, coating her hands and her forearms, and the front of her burlap apron with a fine white film that crackled when she moved. The crystals had worked their way into the creases of her knuckles and under her fingernails, and into the fine lines that crossed her palms. She did not notice this any more than a farmer notices the soil under his fingernails. It was simply the evidence of the work. The level of the fish in the barrel rose slowly, layer by layer. The bottom of the cask was now hidden beneath a solid mass of salted cod, the individual fillets visible only as pale shapes beneath the granular coating that covered them. The salt acted as both a preservative and a separator, keeping each piece of fish from touching its neighbor directly, and allowing the brine to circulate freely through the gaps and crevices of the packed layers. This circulation was essential because it ensured that every part of every fillet was exposed to the preserving action of the salt solution, rather than just the surfaces that touched the salt directly. When the barrel was approximately half full, the woman stopped and looked at her work. She reached into the cask and pressed down firmly on the top layer of fish with both palms, testing the springiness of the packed fillets. There was a slight give, a soft resilience that told her the fish were packed tightly enough to prevent shifting, but not so tightly that the brine would be unable to penetrate between them. She nodded slightly to herself, a small unconscious gesture of satisfaction, and then she reached for another handful of salt. The salt in the bucket was growing low. She could see the bottom of the wooden container, now a dark circle visible through the remaining pile of grey crystals. She would need to refill it soon, but not yet. There was enough for another layer or two. The salt clung to the sides of the bucket in small clumps where the moisture from her hands had dampened it, and she scraped these free with her fingernails, adding them to the pile in her palm. She continued to layer the fish in the salt with the same unhurried patience that had marked the entire morning. The sun had climbed higher in the sky now, and the pale, overcast light had brightened to a soft, diffuse whiteness that made the colors of the harbor seem muted and gentle. The water in the bay had changed from grey to a pale blue-green as the tide continued its slow advance up the stone steps and over the mudflats. The gulls had settled on the roof of the net shed and were preening their feathers with quick darting movements of their beaks, their white bodies bright against the dark red of the clay tiles. At last, the barrel was full. The top layer of salted cod sat just below the rim of the cask, leaving a small gap of perhaps 2 finger widths between the fish and the upper edge. This gap was necessary because when the brine formed and the fish began to release their water, the level would rise slightly, and if the barrel were packed too full, the liquid would overflow and be lost. The woman looked at the full barrel and felt a quiet sense of completion, a feeling that was not excitement or pride, but simply the calm awareness that a task had been finished correctly. She reached for the round wooden lid that leaned against the side of the barrel. The lid was made of the same dark oak as the staves, and it was slightly smaller in diameter than the interior of the cask, so that it could float freely on top of the brine, rather than being fixed in place. She lowered it carefully onto the top layer of fish, pressing it down gently until it rested flat against the salted fillets. The lid was heavy enough to keep the fish submerged when the brine formed, but not so heavy that it would crush the flesh and squeeze out the natural juices that needed to remain within the meat. Now came the final step of the morning's work. The stones sat in their small circle on the stone ramp, where they had been placed earlier when the barrel was first opened. There were 4 of them, each one a smooth grey rock of roughly the same size and shape, having been selected long ago from the beach at low tide for this specific purpose. They were heavy, dense stones that fit comfortably in the palm of a hand, their surfaces worn smooth by years of being handled and submerged and lifted and placed again. The woman bent down and picked up the first stone. It was cold and damp from sitting on the stone ramp, and it left a small wet mark on her palm when she lifted it. She carried it to the barrel and placed it carefully on top of the wooden lid, positioning it near the center, where its weight would be distributed evenly. The stone made a soft, solid thunk as it settled against the wood, a sound that was deeply satisfying in its finality. She picked up the second stone and placed it beside the first, the 2 of them sitting side by side, like a pair of grey eggs in a nest of dark oak. The third stone went next to the second, and the fourth completed the small square of weight that would hold the wooden lid down and keep the fish fully submerged as the brine slowly formed and rose around them. The stones did not look like much, they were plain and grey and unremarkable, but they performed an essential function. Without their weight, the wooden lid would float up as the brine level rose, and the top layer of fish would be exposed to the air, which would cause it to spoil and ruin the entire barrel. The stones were the silent guardians of the preservation process, asking nothing and receiving nothing in return, except the slow erosion of their surfaces by the salt water. The woman stood back and looked at the barrel. It was full and sealed and weighted. The salt was already beginning its quiet work, drawing the moisture from the flesh of the cod and creating the brine that would fill the spaces between the layers. In a few hours, the liquid level would rise enough to cover the wooden lid completely, and the stones would be partially submerged, their grey surfaces darkened by the salt water. The barrel would sit here on the dock for several weeks, perhaps even a month or 2, depending on the weather and the needs of the household. During that time, the cod would slowly transform from fresh perishable fish into firm salted bacalao that could be soaked in fresh water to remove the excess salt, and then cooked into the stews and soups that would warm the winter evenings. The woman wiped her hands on her apron, leaving fresh white streaks of salt across the burlap. She picked up the nearly empty salt bucket and carried it back to the storage shed, where the large clay jars of salt sat waiting, their lids sealed with wooden boards and heavy stones of their own. She would refill the bucket later, before the next batch of fish arrived. For now the morning's work was complete, and the dock was quiet, except for the sound of the tide lapping against the stones and the distant cry of a single gull wheeling high overhead. The barrel sat in its place on the stone ramp, a dark, solid shape against the pale grey of the overcast sky. Inside it, the salt and the fish were beginning their slow, patient dance, a chemical conversation that had been taking place on these docks for hundreds of years and would continue for hundreds more. The stones sat on the lid, unmoving and patient, their weight a quiet, constant presence. And the woman walked slowly up the ramp toward the village, her hands smelling of salt and fish, her mind already turning to the next task of the day, a task that would be just as quiet and just as necessary and just as easily forgotten by the world beyond the fog that rolled in from the Bay of Biscay. The sound of the knife on the cutting board was a sound that belonged to the dock. It was a close sound, a near sound, something that happened within arm's reach and could be felt as much as heard through the vibration that travelled up the wooden handle and into the bones of the hand. The sound of the tide against the stone steps was also a near sound, a constant soft lapping that never stopped and never changed its rhythm. The cry of a gull passing overhead was a sound that moved through the air and faded, quickly swallowed by the fog or the wind, or the simple distance between the bird and the listener. These were the sounds of Lekeitio, the sounds that formed the quiet backdrop of every morning and every afternoon and every evening of the working year. But sometimes, when the wind was blowing from a certain direction and the air was still, and the fog had lifted just enough to let sound travel further than usual, there was another sound. It was so faint that it was almost not a sound at all, more like a suggestion of a sound or the memory of a sound that had been heard once long ago and could not quite be recalled. It came from somewhere far away across the water beyond the mouth of the harbour and past the headlands that sheltered the bay from the open sea. It was a tiny ringing noise, a thin metallic tapping that rose and fell on the breeze like the distant song of a bird whose species no one in the village could name. This sound was the sound of hammers. Hundreds of hammers, perhaps thousands of them, falling on iron nails and wooden pegs, and the thick oak planks of ships that were being built in shipyards so far away that they might as well have existed in another country. And in truth they did exist in another country, or at least in another kingdom, because the shipyards where these hammers rang belonged to the King of Spain, and they lay far to the west and south along the coast of Portugal, in places with names like Lisbon and Setúbal and Portimao. In these yards an enormous fleet was slowly taking shape, a fleet of galleons and galleasses and smaller support vessels that would one day sail north into the English Channel for purposes that the woman on the dock did not think about and did not need to think about. The sound of the distant hammering reached her ears only on certain days. It required the wind to be blowing from the southwest, a warm, damp wind that came across the Bay of Biscay, carrying the smells of the open ocean and the faint tang of the distant shipyards. It required the fog to be absent, or at least high enough that it did not muffle the sound completely. And it required the woman to be standing still for a moment. Her knife paused in mid-motion. Her head tilted slightly as she listened, without quite realizing that she was listening. When the sound did come, it was so faint that she could never be entirely sure whether she was hearing it or imagining it. The tapping was irregular and distant, broken up by gusts of wind that carried the noise away and then brought it back again a few moments later. It sounded like a very small bell being struck with a very small hammer, a high, thin ringing that had no weight or presence. It was the sound of industry and preparation and the gathering of great forces. But from this distance, across all these miles of grey water and rolling swells, it was reduced to something no more substantial than the buzzing of a fly against a window pane. The woman did not know the names of the ships that were being built. She did not know that some of them would be called the San Juan, or the Santa Ana, or the San Felipe. She did not know how many men were labouring in those distant yards, or how many trees had been felled in the forests of Galicia and Asturias to provide the oak for the hulls. She did not know that the fleet would eventually number more than 130 vessels, or that it would carry thousands of soldiers and sailors across the sea. These were facts that belonged to the world of maps and ledgers and royal decrees, a world that had very little to do with the daily rhythm of salting cod on a stone dock in a Basque fishing village. What she did know was the sound of the wind as it passed over the salt piles and through the gaps in the barrel staves. This was a sound she heard every day, a soft sighing whisper that was always present even when she was not consciously attending to it. The wind in Lekeitio was a constant companion, a presence that shaped the way the gulls flew and the way the boats rocked at their moorings and the way the fog moved across the surface of the water. It came from the sea most days, carrying the smell of salt and the faint clean scent of the deep ocean. Sometimes it shifted and came from the land, bringing the smell of wet earth and sheep and the smoke of cooking fires from the houses clustered on the hillside. The wind also carried sounds away from the dock and scattered them across the bay. The sound of her knife on the cutting board did not travel far. It was absorbed by the stone walls and the wooden barrels and the heavy, damp air. The sound of her own breathing was lost entirely, swallowed by the larger sound of the tide and the wind itself. The sound of the distant hammering was carried toward her by the same wind that would a moment later carry it away again, leaving behind only the familiar local noises of the harbour. She did not strain to hear the distant hammers. She did not pause in her work to listen for them or wonder about their source. The sound was simply there on certain days, the way the fog was there or the way a particular gull might perch on a particular piling. It was a part of the background of the world, a detail so small and so intermittent that it barely registered in her conscious mind. If someone had asked her at the end of the day whether she had heard the hammering from across the sea, she might have paused and thought for a moment, and then said that she was not sure, that perhaps she had heard something, but she could not say what it was. The hammering continued in the distant shipyards, whether the woman heard it or not. It continued in the morning when the fog was thick and the sound was trapped close to the ground. It continued in the afternoon when the sun broke through and the air warmed and the sound travelled further, but also scattered more in the shifting thermals. It continued in the evening when the light faded and the workers in the shipyards finally set down their tools and the hammers fell silent for the night. The fleet was growing, day by day, week by month. each ship a collection of thousands of pieces of wood, each piece shaped and fitted and fastened by hands that would never touch the salt cod of Lekeitio. The woman's hands moved in their familiar rhythm. She picked up a fresh cod from the basket and laid it on the table. She made the cut behind the gills and drew the knife along the spine. She flipped the fish and made the second cut. She removed the skeleton and scraped away the bloodline. She sprinkled the salt and rubbed it into the flesh. She placed the fillet in the barrel and pressed it down. The sounds that accompanied these actions were the sounds she knew best, the sounds that had been with her since she was a child, watching her mother do this same work at this same work. The sound of the knife on the bone was a crisp, brief crunch that lasted only a fraction of a second. The sound of the blade sliding through the flesh was a soft, wet whisper that varied slightly, depending on the thickness of the meat. The sound of the salt falling onto the wet fillet was a gentle hissing patter, like rain on a wool blanket. These sounds were immediate and real, and they filled her ears and her attention, leaving very little room for anything else. And yet the distant hammering was still there on the edge of perception, a faint metallic shimmer that came and went with the gusts of wind. It was the sound of a world that was preparing for something large and consequential, but that largeness and that consequence did not reach this far. They dissipated over the water the way the smoke from a distant fire dissipates into the sky, becoming first a haze, and then a memory, and then nothing at all. The gulls did not hear the hammering. Their ears were tuned to the sounds that mattered to them, the splash of a fish breaking the surface, the cry of another gull announcing a find, the soft scrape of the woman's wooden shoes on the stone ramp as she approached with the clay pot of scraps. They sat on the red tile roofs and the wooden pilings, their heads cocked slightly, their yellow eyes watching the water and the dock and the woman, with an ancient patience that asked nothing of the future and remembered nothing of the past. The tide did not hear the hammering. It continued its slow, eternal rhythm, rising and falling in response to the pull of the moon and the sun forces that were so much larger than any fleet of ships that they could not be compared. The water crept up the stone steps and then retreated, leaving behind a line of wet stone and tiny stranded pools, where small crabs and sea snails waited for the next high tide. This cycle had been repeating since long before the first ship was ever built, and it would continue repeating long after the last ship of any fleet had rotted away to nothing. The woman finished the morning's cutting and stood for a moment with her hands resting on the edge of the table. The wind had shifted slightly, and the faint ringing from across the sea was gone, replaced by the more familiar sound of the water lapping against the harbour wall and the distant bleating of sheep on the hillside. She did not notice the absence of the hammering, just as she had barely noticed its presence. The sound had come and gone like a cloud passing in front of the sun, a small variation in the texture of the day that required no response and left no trace. She picked up the bucket of scraps and carried it down to the water's edge. The gulls stirred on their perches, and a few of them took flight, circling overhead with their harsh cries that echoed off the stone walls. She emptied the bucket onto the wet rocks and stepped back as the birds descended in a flurry of white wings. The noise of their squabbling was loud for a moment, and then it settled into the background, joining the sound of the tide and the wind and the distant sheep as just another layer in the quiet music of the village. She walked back to the table and began to clean her knife. She dipped the blade in the bucket of seawater and wiped it dry with the corner of her apron. The steel was stained a darker grey than it had been that morning, the fish oils and the salt having worked their way into the microscopic grooves of the metal. She held the knife up to the pale light and looked at the edge, checking for any nicks or dull spots that would need attention. The edge was still true, a fine straight line of sharpened steel that caught the light in a thin silver gleam. She would hone it later in the week on the smooth stone that sat in a corner of the kitchen, but for now it was good enough. The barrel sat on the dock with its lid in place and its stones weighing it down. Inside, the salt was doing its slow, quiet work, drawing the water from the fish and creating the brine that would preserve the flesh through the coming months. The barrel did not know about the fleet being built across the sea. It did not know about the King of Spain or the Queen of England or the plans that were being made in distant courts. It knew only the weight of the stones and the chemistry of the salt and the patient passing of the days. The woman covered the barrel with the heavy canvas that was stiff with dried salt and secured the corners with small stones. The canvas flapped once in the breeze and then settled into stillness, a pale grey shape against the darker grey of the stone ramp. She picked up her empty basket and her empty salt bucket and began to walk slowly up the ramp toward the village. The street that led up from the harbour was narrow and steep, paved with the same grey stones that formed the dock. The houses on either side were built of whitewashed stone, with red tile roofs and small windows that looked out over the water. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, thin grey columns that leaned inland with the breeze. An old woman sat on a wooden bench outside one of the doors, her hands busy with a piece of knitting, her eyes watching the harbour with the calm, unfocused gaze of someone who had seen the same view every day for 70 years. The woman nodded to the old woman as she passed, and the old woman nodded back. No words were exchanged because no words were needed. The rhythm of the village was a quiet rhythm, a rhythm of nods and glances and small gestures that said everything that needed to be said. She reached her own doorway, a dark wooden door set into a whitewashed wall. She pushed it open and stepped inside into the cool, dim interior that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and the faint, clean scent of wool. She set the basket and the bucket down in their places by the door. She would need them again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Somewhere far across the water, the hammers were still falling. The great fleet was still growing piece by piece, nail by nail, plank by plank. In a little more than a year it would set sail heading north into waters that the woman had never seen and would never see. But here in Lekeitio the afternoon was quiet and the tide was coming in, and the fog was beginning to gather again out beyond the headlands. The sounds that mattered were the sounds of the village, the sounds of the water and the wind and the gulls and the soft familiar rhythm of a life that continued unchanged, regardless of what was being built beyond the horizon. The cod that came to the dock in Lekeitio were not all the same. They arrived in the same wicker baskets carried by the same fishermen who had pulled them from the same grey waters of the Bay of Biscay during the same dark hours before dawn, but each fish was its own creature with its own particular shape and weight and history. The woman who stood at the wooden table with her knife in her hand knew this in the way that a baker knows that no two loaves of bread will rise exactly the same, or that a spinner knows that no two skeins of wool will have precisely the same thickness. The variations were small, and they did not change the nature of the work, but they were there, and she noticed them without really thinking about them. The first fish she lifted from the basket on this particular morning was a large one, a female cod that had lived perhaps 8 or 9 years in the cold deep waters beyond the continental shelf. Its body was long and thick through the shoulders, the flesh firm and dense beneath the mottled skin. When she laid it on the table, it covered nearly the entire width of the wooden surface from the head that pointed toward the stone ledge to the tail that hung slightly over the far edge. The weight of it pressed down against her palms as she positioned it, a solid, reassuring heaviness that spoke of many winters spent feeding in the dark, and many summers spent swimming slowly through the green gloom. The second fish was smaller, perhaps a male of 5 or 6 years. It had a slightly different shape to its head, a bit more pointed at the snout, with a jaw that protruded just a little further than the female's jaw had done. The flesh of this fish was softer when she pressed her thumb into its flank, yielding more easily under the pressure and springing back more slowly. This was not a defect. It was simply a difference, the result of the fish's age and diet, and the particular currents it had swum against during its life. The salt would work on this softer flesh in the same way it worked on the firmer flesh of the larger female, drawing out the water and replacing it with the preserving brine. But the process would happen a little faster, and the final texture of the cured fish would be slightly more tender. The third fish bore a scar on its left flank, a pale silvery line that ran from just behind the gills to somewhere near the middle of its body. The scar was old and well healed, the edges smooth and slightly raised above the surrounding skin. It was the mark of a net that had cut into the fish's side many months or perhaps even years ago, a net that had been pulled up too quickly or handled too roughly by some other fisherman in some other part of the sea. The cod had survived the encounter and swum away and continued its life, and now it lay on the wooden table in Lekeitio, its old wound a pale reminder of a moment that no one would ever know about. The woman ran her thumb over the scar, feeling the slight ridge of the healed tissue beneath the scales. The scar did not affect the way the fish would cut, or the way the salts would penetrate the flesh. It was simply a mark, a small variation in the surface of things that distinguished this particular cod from all the other cod that had ever been caught and cut and salted on this dock. She noted it, and then she forgot it, because the knife was already in her hand, and the first cut was already being made. The anatomy of the cod was a thing she knew without having ever been taught. She knew where the spine ran beneath the flesh, and where the ribs curved away from the backbone like the arches of a tiny cathedral made of bone. She knew that the lateral line, that faint ridge that ran from gill to tail, was a sensory organ that the fish had used to detect movement and vibration in the water, and that it had no particular taste or texture that mattered for the salting. She knew that the bloodline was denser and oilier than the surrounding white meat, and that it would spoil faster if it was not removed. She knew all of these things in the same way that she knew the sound of her own footsteps on the stone ramp. The fourth fish had a slightly darker speckling on its skin, a pattern of olive and brown and grey that was more pronounced than the patterns on the fish that had come before it. The speckling was a form of camouflage that helped the cod blend in with the rocky seafloor where it had spent its life hunting for smaller fish and crustaceans. Some cod lived over sandy bottoms and their skins were paler and less marked. Others lived among the kelp forests and their skins carried a greenish tint from the algae that grew on their scales. This particular cod had come from a rocky area, perhaps near one of the underwater ridges that rose from the deep ocean floor. Its skin told a story about the place it had called home, and the woman saw this story without reading it, the way a person might glance at the cover of a book without opening its pages. The fifth fish was missing a small piece of its tail fin, a neat triangular notch that had probably been bitten away by a larger fish, or perhaps by a seal. The wound was healed cleanly, and the fin had continued to grow around the missing piece, leaving a permanent gap that made the tail slightly asymmetrical. When the woman cut the fillet from this fish, she had to adjust her grip slightly to account for the shorter tail, but this adjustment was so small and so automatic that she did not notice she was making it. The salt worked differently on each of these fish, and the woman knew this too. The larger fish with its thicker flesh would take longer to cure and would require more salt to draw out all of the moisture. The smaller, softer fish would cure more quickly and might need to be removed from the barrel sooner to prevent it from becoming too dry and hard. The fish with the scar would cure unevenly around the raised tissue, creating a small area where the texture would be slightly different when the fish was eventually soaked and cooked. These differences were not problems. They were simply the natural variation of working with living things that had been taken from the sea. The flies came as they always did, drawn by the smell of the fresh fish and the salt and the faint sweetness of the bloodline that collected in the clay pot. They were small black flies with shiny bodies and wings that caught the light in tiny rainbows when the sun hit them at the right angle. They did not swarm or buzz in great numbers. There were only a few of them, perhaps half a dozen at any given time, circling lazily around the rim of the salt bucket and the edge of the cutting table. They landed on the wood for a moment, rubbing their front legs together in that strange, thoughtful gesture that flies have, and then they took off again, circling once or twice before landing somewhere else. The woman did not hate the flies. They were a part of the dock, the same way the gulls were a part of the dock, and the tide was a part of the dock. She shooed them away when they landed too close to the fresh fillets. A lazy wave of her hand that sent them buzzing up into the air for a moment before they settled back down again. The gesture was so automatic that she was not even aware of doing it, her hand moving in its small arc while her eyes remained on the fish and the knife and the salt. A cat lived under the table. It was a small cat with grey fur that was the exact colour of the stone ramp on an overcast day, and with eyes that were a pale green like the sea just after a storm. The cat belonged to no one in particular. It simply lived on the dock and ate the scraps that the gulls did not get, and slept in the warmest patches of sun it could find. During the mornings it curled up beneath the table in the narrow space between the wooden legs and the stone floor, a spot that was sheltered from the wind and that caught the warmth of the woman's body as she stood working above. The cat did not move very much. Occasionally it would stretch one paw out in front of it, flexing the small pink pads and the tiny curved claws before tucking the paw back under its chest. Occasionally it would yawn a wide, slow yawn that showed its small sharp teeth and the pink roughness of its tongue. Occasionally it would open its eyes halfway and watch the woman's feet as they shifted slightly with the rhythm of her work, and then it would close them again and sink back into the half-sleep that cats do so well. The woman was aware of the cat in the same way that she was aware of the flies and the tide and the distant sound of the hammering that came and went with the wind. It was a presence that required nothing from her, and that offered nothing in return except the quiet comfort of another living creature sharing the same space and the same slow passage of the morning. She did not speak to the cat, and the cat did not speak to her. They simply existed together, each one absorbed in its own small world. The variations in the cod continued as the morning wore on. One fish had a slightly crooked spine, a gentle curve that had probably been present since birth, and that had not prevented it from swimming and feeding and growing to a respectable size. The curve made it slightly more difficult to cut the fillet cleanly, because the blade wants to follow the straight line of habit rather than the gentle arc of the bone. The woman adjusted her angle without thinking, and the cut was made and the fillet was removed, and the crooked spine went into the clay pot with all the others. Another fish had a patch of discolored flesh near its tail, a small area where the meat was a dull grayish color rather than the translucent pearl white of the surrounding tissue. This was a bruise, an injury that had occurred when the fish was caught in the net and hauled up from the deep water. The pressure change and the struggle against the mesh had caused small blood vessels to rupture beneath the skin, and the blood had seeped into the flesh, leaving this faint stain. The woman scraped the discolored area away with the tip of her knife and dropped the small piece into the clay pot. The rest of the fillet was perfectly good. The gulls on the roof of the net shed watched all of this with their yellow eyes. They saw the woman's hands moving in their familiar rhythm, and they saw the fish being cut and salted and placed in the barrel. They saw the flies circling and the cat sleeping, and the tide creeping slowly up the stone steps. They saw all of these things, but they understood only one thing, which was that eventually the clay pot would be carried down to the water's edge and emptied onto the rocks, and they would have their meal. The woman paused in her work and straightened her back, pressing her hands against her lower spine. She looked out over the harbor at the water that had changed from the pale gray of early morning to a deeper blue-green as the sun climbed higher and burned away the last of the haze. The boats that had gone out before dawn were returning now, their sails furled and their oars working slowly against the tide. She could see the fishermen in their small vessels, their dark shapes moving against the brightness of the water. They would reach the dock soon and unload their catch into the baskets. And tomorrow morning she would stand at this same table and cut those fish, just as she was cutting these. She turned back to the basket and lifted out another cod. This one was a female, heavy with roe, the roundness of her belly, a sign of the thousands of tiny eggs that she had been carrying when she was caught. The roe would have been released into the water in a few weeks if the fish had lived, spawning a new generation of cod that would drift as larvae in the currents and grow, and eventually be caught by some other fisherman in some other year. The woman cut the fish open and removed the 2 long lobes of roe, setting them aside in a small wooden bowl. The roe was a delicacy that would be salted separately and eaten later, pressed into cakes and fried in olive oil. Nothing was wasted. The flies landed on the rim of the wooden bowl and the woman waved them away. The cat beneath the table stirred and opened one eye, watching the movement of her hand, and then closed it again. The knife continued its slow, steady work. The salt bucket was nearly empty again, and the pile of grey crystals in the bottom was growing low. The woman scooped up the last handful and sprinkled it over the final layer of fish in the barrel, pressing the salt into the flesh with her fingertips. The crystals crunched softly against the wet meat, and the familiar hissing whisper of the falling salt faded into silence. She brushed the remaining grains from her palm and watched them fall like tiny stars into the dark interior of the cask. The barrel was full now, another morning's work completed. The fish lay in their neat layers beneath their blanket of salt, their individual differences slowly being erased by the uniform action of the brine. The large fish and the small fish, the scarred fish and the speckled fish, the crooked fish and the bruised fish, all of them would become the same thing in the end. Salted cod, preserved and patient and ready for the long wait until they were needed. The woman placed the wooden lid on top of the fish and lowered the heavy stones into their familiar positions. The stones settled with a soft, solid thunk, and the barrel was sealed, and the quiet chemistry of preservation began its slow, invisible work. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked down at the cat, who had not moved from its spot beneath the table. The cat's grey fur rose and fell with the slow rhythm of its breathing, and its pale green eyes were closed, and its small pink nose twitched once in its sleep. She carried the clay pot of scraps down to the water and emptied it onto the rocks. The gulls descended and the noise of their feeding filled the air for a moment, before settling back into the usual quiet of the afternoon. She washed her knife in the bucket of seawater and dried it on the corner of her apron and placed it on the stone ledge where it would wait for tomorrow. The flies had scattered when she moved the clay pot, and now they were settling back onto the rim of the salt bucket, finding nothing there but the faint residue of salt that was not worth their attention. One by one they lifted into the air and drifted away across the harbor toward whatever other smells might draw them. The cat remained asleep beneath the table, its small body a warm grey shape in the cool shadow of the wood. The woman stood for a while, looking at nothing in particular, her hands resting on the edge of the table, feeling the familiar grain of the wood beneath her fingertips. The variations in the cod were already fading from her memory, replaced by the sameness of the task completed and the sameness of the task that would begin again tomorrow. The fish were fish, and the salt was salt, and the tide was the tide. The world continued in its quiet, patient way, asking nothing more of her than what she had already given. The tide in the harbour of Lekeitio was a thing that could be measured in the height of the water against the stone steps, or in the length of the shadows that fell across the ramp, or in the sound of the small waves as they changed their rhythm from a gentle lapping to a soft, sucking noise against the mud. The woman who worked at the wooden table did not need to look at the water to know where the tide stood. She could feel it in the way the air smelled different when the mud flats were exposed, and in the way the gulls changed their behavior when the shallows were full of small fish trapped by the falling water. She could hear it in the creaking of the boats as they settled onto the bottom or rose up against their moorings, and she could sense it in the way the light reflected differently off the wet stones when they were submerged versus when they were bare and drying in the sun. The stone steps that led down from the dock into the harbour were old and worn and covered in barnacles. There were 12 of them in total, though the lowest 4 were only visible at the very bottom of the tide when the water retreated far enough to expose the dark green mud that lay beneath the harbour floor. The steps were not uniform in height or depth, each one having been cut from the local greystone by hands that had worked long ago and that had not been overly concerned with precise measurements. Some steps were shallow and easy to descend, requiring only a small drop of the foot, while others were deeper and demanded a longer stride that could be awkward when carrying a heavy bucket or a basket of fish. The barnacles that covered the lower steps were small and sharp and white-grey in color, their tiny shells forming a rough crust that crunched underfoot when anyone walked down to the water's edge. The barnacles were living creatures that opened their shells when the tide covered them, extending feathery legs into the water to catch the tiny particles of food that drifted past. When the tide went out, they closed themselves up, tightly sealing their shells against the air and waiting patiently for the water to return. They had been doing this for as long as the steps had existed, and they would continue doing it long after the steps themselves had worn away to nothing. The woman stood at the top of the steps in the late afternoon, after the day's cutting and salting was finished. She had come down to rinse her hands in the clean seawater before walking back up to the village, and she paused for a moment looking out at the harbour. The tide was low, now the lowest it would be all day, and the water had retreated far down the steps, exposing the dark wet stones and the thick layer of mud that stretched out toward the centre of the harbour channel. The mud was a deep greenish-brown colour, studded with small rocks and broken shells and the occasional piece of driftwood that had become half-buried over time. It glistened in the pale afternoon light, reflecting the grey-white of the sky in a dull sheen. The smell of the low tide was a particular smell that was not unpleasant, but that was distinct and unmistakable. It was the smell of the sea concentrated and slowed the smell of kelp and salt and the small creatures that lived in the mud, and the faint clean scent of minerals released from the stones as the water drained away. The woman breathed this smell in without thinking about it because it was the smell of the harbour, and it had been the smell of her entire life. It was as familiar to her as the smell of her own kitchen or the smell of the wool blanket on her bed. The boats that were moored in the harbour sat at odd angles now that the water had left them. Some of the smaller vessels rested directly on the mud, their hulls tilted to one side or the other, depending on the contour of the bottom beneath them. Their masts pointed at strange angles toward the sky, and their nets hung limp and drying over the sides. The ropes that held them to their moorings were taut, now stretched tight by the weight of the boats pulling against the anchors that were buried deep in the mud. These ropes were made of hemp, a coarse brown fiber that had been twisted and braided into thick cables that were strong enough to hold against the pull of the tide and the push of the wind. The ropes creaked as the boat settled. It was a slow sound, a long, low groaning that rose and fell as the hulls shifted against the mud and the tension in the fibers adjusted to the changing load. The sound was not loud. It was barely audible above the whisper of the wind and the distant cry of the gulls. But it was there, a constant background note that spoke of weight and resistance, and the patient endurance of simple things. The woman walked down the steps carefully, placing her feet on the drier patches of stone to avoid slipping on the wet barnacles. She reached the lowest exposed step and crouched down, dipping her hands into the cool, clear water that still filled the small channel at the center of the harbor. The water was cold and clean, and it washed away the salt and the fish oil that had accumulated on her skin during the morning's work. She rubbed her hands together, slowly feeling the grit of the salt dissolve and the slickness of the oil lift away. When her hands were clean, she cupped them together and lifted a small amount of water to her face, splashing it against her cheeks and her forehead. The cold was sharp for a moment, and then it faded, leaving behind a clean, fresh feeling that was one of the small pleasures of the day. She straightened up and looked back toward the dock. The wooden table stood in its place beneath the overhang of red tiles, and the barrel sat beside it, with its canvas cover and its heavy stones. The cat had emerged from beneath the table and was sitting on the warm stone ramp, washing its face with a slow, deliberate paw. The gulls had returned to the roof of the net shed and were settling down for the afternoon, their white bodies bright against the dark red of the clay tiles. Everything was in its place, and everything was as it should be. The ropes that held the fishing boats were not the only ropes in the harbor. There were other ropes as well, thinner ones and shorter ones that served different purposes. There were ropes that hung from the wooden pilings, their ends frayed and bleached by the sun. There were ropes that were coiled neatly on the decks of the boats, waiting to be used for raising sails or lowering nets. There were ropes that were tied to the iron rings set into the stone walls of the dock, used for securing vessels when they came in with their catch. And there was the rope that hung from the bucket the woman used to draw seawater for rinsing the table, and the knife, a simple length of hemp that was dark with moisture and stiff with salt. This rope had a particular feel to it when she pulled the bucket up from the water. It was rough against her palms, the fibers slightly scratchy where they had dried and hardened, and slightly slippery where they were still wet. The rope made a soft sound as it moved through the iron ring, a gentle rasping whisper that was different from the creaking of the mooring lines. It was a smaller sound, a closer sound that closened to her hands and her work rather than to the larger rhythms of the harbor. The tide would turn soon. The woman could tell by the way the water at the bottom of the steps had stopped retreating and was now holding steady, a line of wet stone that neither advanced nor fell back. This was the slack tide, the brief pause between the ebb and the flow when the water seemed to rest and gather itself for the long, slow climb back up the steps. It lasted only a short while, perhaps the time it took to cut and saw two fish, or to walk from the dock to the upper street and back. Then the water would begin to move again, creeping upward over the mud and the barnacles and the grey stones inch by inch until it reached the top of the steps and lapped once more against the stone ramp where the barrel sat. The woman had watched this cycle more times than she could possibly count. She had watched it as a child sitting on the steps with her bare feet dangling in the water. She had watched it as a young woman helping her mother carry the heavy baskets of fish up from the boats. She had watched it as a grown woman standing at the cutting table with a knife in her hand, pausing for a moment to glance out at the harbor and note the position of the water against the familiar stones. The tide was one of the few things in her world that never changed, that could always be counted on to do exactly what it had done the day before and exactly what it would do the day after. She turned away from the water and began to walk back up the steps. Her wooden shoes made a soft clacking sound against the stone, a sound that echoed slightly off the walls of the buildings that lined the harbor. The cat watched her approach with its pale green eyes but did not move from its spot on the warm stone. The woman stepped around the cat and picked up the bucket of seawater she had drawn earlier, carrying it over to the table to rinse the wood one final time before she left for the day. She poured the water slowly across the surface of the table, watching it spread out in a thin sheet and run off the edges onto the stone ramp. She took the rag made of old sailcloth and wiped the wood down, moving in slow circles, the same circles she had made that morning and would make again tomorrow. The wood was clean and smooth and slightly damp, and it would dry in the afternoon air and be ready for the next day's work. The barrel sat beside the table, its canvas cover flapping softly in the breeze. The stones on top of the lid were visible as four dark shapes beneath the fabric, their weight pressing down on the fish and the salt and the slowly forming brine. The woman did not need to check the barrel. She knew that everything inside it was happening exactly as it should. The salt was drawing out the moisture, and the moisture was dissolving the salt, and the brine was rising slowly around the layers of fish. In a few days, she would open the barrel and check the level of the liquid, adding more salt if it was needed, and perhaps rearranging the stones to ensure an even pressure. But that was a task for another day. She hung the rag over the edge of the table to dry, and she placed the bucket upside down beside the barrel, where it would not collect rainwater or debris. She picked up her knife and held it for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of it in her hand before setting it down on the stone ledge. The knife was clean and dry, and its edge was still true, and it would wait there through the night and be ready when she returned. The tide had begun to turn. She could see it now from the top of the ramp, a thin line of darker wet stone appearing just above the water's edge as the sea began its slow advance. The boats that had been resting on the mud were starting to shift, their hulls creaking and groaning as the water lifted them slightly, easing the tension on their mooring ropes. The sound of the ropes changed as the load decreased to the tight high creak, giving way to a looser lower sound that was almost a sigh of relief. The woman stood for a moment and watched the water move. It was so slow that she could not actually see it advancing, only the evidence of its progress in the changing color of the stone and the shifting position of the boats. It was a motion that required patience to observe, a motion that could not be rushed or hurried. It moved at its own pace, and it asked nothing of the watcher except stillness and attention. The gulls on the roof stirred, and one of them lifted into the air, circling once before flying off toward the mouth of the harbor. The cat beneath the table stretched and yawned, and then curled itself into a tighter ball, tucking its nose beneath its tail. The wind shifted slightly, coming now from the north rather than the west, carrying the faint smell of the hills and the sheep that grazed there. The woman turned and began to walk up the narrow street toward the village. Her wooden shoes made their soft clacking sound on the cobblestones, and the sound echoed off the whitewashed walls and faded into the quiet of the afternoon. Behind her the tide continued its slow, patient climb up the stone steps, and the ropes continued their quiet creaking, and the barrel continued its silent work of preservation. Everything was in motion, and everything was at rest, and the difference between the two was only a matter of how closely one chose to look. The light in Lekeitio changed slowly as the afternoon wore on, a gradual transformation that was so subtle and so steady that it was difficult to say exactly when the morning ended and the evening began. The high white brightness of midday, when the sun stood somewhere behind the thin layer of cloud and cast a pale, even illumination over everything, gave way by degrees to a softer, warmer quality of light that seemed to come from lower in the sky, and that painted the stone walls and the red tile roofs with faint washes of amber and gold. The shadows that had been short and sharp beneath the table and the barrel began to lengthen and soften, stretching out across the stone ramp like dark water spreading slowly from a spilled bucket. The woman noticed this change in the light without stopping her work. Her hands continued their familiar rhythm of cutting and salting and layering, but her eyes registered the shifting colors, the way the grey stone of the dock took on a faint warmth, and the way the water in the harbor lost its pale blue-green tint and deepened toward a darker slate color that was almost purple where the shadows of the headlands fell across it. The light was a clock that needed no winding and made no sound, and she had been reading it for so many years that she could tell the hour within a few minutes simply by the angle of the sunbeam that fell across the corner of the cutting table. By the time the last fish of the day had been cut and salted and pressed into the barrel, the light had mellowed into a rich sepia tone that reminded her of the color of old parchment or the color of the foam on a cup of strong tea. The harsh edges of the morning had been worn away, and everything in the harbor seemed to have settled into a quieter, more contemplative state. The gulls on the roof of the net shed had stopped their restless circling and were now sitting still, their white feathers tinged with a faint pinkish glow from the setting sun that was hidden behind the clouds. The cat beneath the table had uncurled itself and was sitting up, washing one ear with a slow, deliberate paw, its grey fur looking almost warm in the golden light. The woman straightened her back and pressed her hands against her lower spine, feeling the familiar ache that came from standing in one position for many hours. The ache was not sharp or painful. It was a dull, deep sensation that spoke of muscles well used and a task well completed. She rolled her shoulders slowly first, one and then the other, feeling the joints make small, quiet sounds like the creaking of the mooring ropes down at the water's edge. The work of the day was finished, but the work of the evening was about to begin a different kind of work that was slower and gentler, and that marked the boundary between the labor of the morning and the rest of the night. The first task of the evening was the cleaning of the knife. She picked it up from the stone ledge where it had been lying and held it up to the fading light. The blade was smeared with a thin film of fish oil and dotted with tiny flecks of white flesh that had dried and stuck to the steel. The edge was still true, but the surface of the metal was dull and grey and in need of attention. She carried the knife to the bucket of seawater that sat beside the table and dipped the blade into the cool water, watching the ripples spread out across the surface and the small particles of fish lift away and drift slowly toward the bottom. She reached into the pocket of her apron and took out a small piece of cloth that had been cut from an old linen shirt, and that was soft and clean and slightly frayed at the edges. She dipped the cloth into the water and then wrapped it around the flat of the blade, wiping from the bolster down toward the tip in one long, smooth motion. The cloth came away stained with a faint grey residue, and she rinsed it in the bucket and wiped again, repeating the process until the steel was clean and bright and the water in the bucket had grown cloudy with the remains of the day's work. The handle of the knife required a different kind of care. The boxwood had absorbed salt and oil and moisture during the long morning, and its surface felt slightly rough and sticky beneath her fingers. She dampened a fresh corner of the cloth and rubbed it gently over the wood, working it into the grain and then wiping away the residue. The handle lightened slightly as the accumulated grime lifted away, revealing the pale golden color of the wood beneath. She dried the handle with a dry corner of the cloth and then held the knife up once more, turning it slowly in the amber light to make sure that no spot had been missed. When the knife was cleaned, she placed it back on the stone ledge, but not in the same position where it had lain during the work. She moved it slightly further back away from the edge so that it would not be accidentally knocked to the ground during the night, and she aligned it carefully so that the blade pointed toward the wall and the handle pointed toward the sea. This was a small ritual that she had performed for years without ever thinking about why she did it. The knife was ready for tomorrow, and it would wait there through the darkness and the fog and the early morning chill until her hand reached for it again. The cleaning of the wooden table was a more substantial task. The surface of the wood had been scrubbed with salt and seawater at the beginning of the day, but now, after hours of cutting and salting and pressing, it was covered with a thin layer of dried fish residue and salt crystals and the faint oily sheen that came from the flesh of the cod. She reached for the bucket of clean seawater that she had drawn earlier and poured a generous amount across the tabletop, watching the water spread out in a thin, glistening sheet and begin to drip over the edges onto the stone ramp. She took a handful of coarse salt from the bucket that sat beside the barrel and scattered it over the wet wood. The salt crystals sparkled in the evening light and made a soft crunching sound as she pressed her palm against them and began to scrub in slow, methodical circles. The salt acted as a gentle abrasive, wearing away the dried residue without scratching the surface of the wood, and the seawater dissolved the oils and carried them away. She scrubbed the entire surface of the table from the end where the fish heads had rested to the end where the tails had hung over the edge, working her way across the grain, and then with the grain until every inch of the wood had been cleaned. The sound of the scrubbing was a soft, rhythmic rasp that blended with the sound of the tide lapping against the stone steps and a distant cry of a single gull. It was a peaceful sound, a sound that spoke of completion and care and the quiet satisfaction of putting things in order. She scrubbed until her arm grew tired, and then she switched hands, scrubbing with her left hand while her right rested on the edge of the table. The salt dissolved slowly under the friction, becoming a fine paste that coated the wood and then washed away when she poured another bucket of fresh seawater over the surface. She dried the table with the old sailcloth rag, wiping in long sweeping motions that followed the grain of the wood. The water beaded up and was absorbed by the cloth, and the wood beneath emerged clean and smooth and slightly darker than it had been in the morning. She ran her palm over the surface, feeling the familiar texture of the grain and the slight warmth that the wood had absorbed from the afternoon sun. The table was ready for the night and for the next day and for all the days that would follow. The barrel required less attention, but it required some. She lifted the corner of the heavy canvas cover and peered inside, checking the level of the brine that had formed during the day. The liquid was a pale amber color, and it had risen enough to cover the wooden lid, completely submerging the stones that sat on top. This was as it should be, and she let the canvas fall back into place, smoothing it down with her palms to ensure that it was secure. The canvas was stiff with dried salt, and it crackled softly under her touch, a sound like walking on dry leaves. She gathered the small stones that she had used to weigh down the corners of the canvas and placed them back where they belonged, each one finding its familiar spot. The stones were smooth and grey and cool to the touch, and they'd been used for this purpose for so long that they had worn small depressions into the fabric of the canvas where they rested. She fitted each stone into its depression and pressed down gently, and the canvas settled into stillness, its flapping silenced for the night. The clay pot that held the fish scraps had been emptied earlier, and now it sat upside down on the stone ramp, drying in the last of the evening light. She picked it up and carried it to the water's edge, where she rinsed it thoroughly in the clear sea water, using her fingers to scrub away any remaining bits of flesh or scale. The pot was made of unglazed earthenware, and it absorbed some of the water, darkening to a deeper red-brown color as she rinsed it. She set it on the steps to dry, and then walked back up to the table. The bucket that had held the salt was empty. Now its contents transferred to the barrel during the long morning of layering. She carried it to the water and rinsed it as well, sloshing the sea water around the inside to dissolve any remaining salt crystals that clung to the wood. The water in the bucket turned cloudy and then clear, and she emptied it onto the stone ramp, where it ran in small rivulets down toward the harbor, joining the other trickles of water that made their way back to the sea. She turned the bucket upside down and placed it beside the barrel, where it would stay until tomorrow morning, when she would carry it up to the storage shed and fill it with fresh salt from the large clay jars. The bucket had a small crack near its bottom, a thin dark line that had appeared years ago and that had never grown larger. It did not leak enough to matter, and she had never bothered to repair it. The crack was simply a part of the bucket, the way the scar on the fish had been a part of the fish, and she accepted it without thought. The apron she wore was stiff with salt and fish oil and the dried residue of the day's work. She untied the strings at her waist and at her neck and lifted the apron over her head, folding it carefully into a neat square. The burlap was rough against her hands, and it released a faint cloud of salt dust when she shook it out. She laid the folded apron on the table, where it would wait for her in the morning, and she brushed the front of her wool dress with her palms, feeling the grit of salt that had worked its way through the fabric. The salt would shake out eventually, or it would wash out in the next rain, and in the meantime it was simply there, a small reminder of the work. The light had continued to fade while she cleaned, and now the harbor was bathed in a soft grey-blue twilight that made the whitewashed walls of the village glow faintly against the darkening hills. The water in the harbor had turned to a smooth, dark silver, and the boats at their moorings were nothing more than dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky. A few lights had appeared in the windows of the houses up the hill, small warm squares of yellow-orange that spoke of fires lit and meals being prepared. The woman stood for a moment with her hands resting on the edge of the clean table, and looked out over the harbor. The tide was high now, covering the stone steps and lapping softly against the ramp just a few feet from where she stood. The sound of the water was different at high tide, a fuller, rounder sound that lacked the sucking noise of the mudflats and the creaking of the boats settling on the bottom. It was a sound that filled the harbor and spilled up into the narrow streets, a constant, gentle presence that would continue through the night. The gulls had gone wherever gulls go when the light fails. The roof of the net shed was empty and dark, and the only birds still visible were a few small swallows that darted low over the water, catching the last insects of the evening. Their flight was quick and erratic, sharp turns and sudden dips that seemed to have no pattern but that served their purpose perfectly. The woman watched them for a moment and then turned away. The cat had moved from beneath the table and was now sitting on the stone ramp a few feet away, washing its face with the same slow, deliberate paw. Its grey fur blended almost perfectly with the grey stone, and only its pale green eyes and the small pink triangle of its nose gave away its presence. The woman made a soft clicking sound with her tongue, and the cat looked up at her for a moment and then returned to its washing. It would find its own way up to the village when it was ready, or it would find a warm spot under the eaves of the net shed and sleep there until morning. The cat belonged to no one and to everyone, and it made its own decisions. The woman picked up the bucket of dirty water that she had used for rinsing and carried it to the edge of the ramp, where she poured it slowly onto the stones. The water spread out in a dark stain and then faded as it soaked into the porous rock or ran down toward the harbor. She set the bucket down and picked up the knife from its place on the ledge, tucking it carefully into a fold of her skirt where it would be safe during the walk up the hill. The knife was too valuable to leave on the dock overnight, even in a village where no one locked their doors. She took one last look around the dock. The table was clean and dry. The barrel was covered and weighted. The canvas was still and secure. The clay pot was rinsed and drying on the steps. The bucket was upside down beside the barrel. Everything was in its place and everything was ready for the morning. She began to walk up the stone ramp toward the narrow street that led into the village. Her wooden shoes made their soft clacking sound on the stones, a sound that echoed slightly off the walls and then faded into the larger sound of the tide. The evening air was cool against her face, and it carried the smell of the sea and the smell of wood smoke from the chimneys up the hill. The street was steep and winding, and the houses on either side were close together, their upper stories leaning slightly toward one another as if they were old friends sharing secrets. Light spilled from a few open doorways, casting warm yellow rectangles across the cobblestones. She could hear the murmur of voices from inside some of the houses, the low sound of conversation that had no urgency and no particular purpose. It was the sound of people settling into the evening, the sound of the day ending and the night beginning. She reached her own doorway and pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping into the dark interior of her home. The room was small and simple, with a packed earth floor and whitewashed walls and a single window that looked out over the harbor. A fire burned low in the hearth, and the smell of a simple stew hung in the air. She set the knife down on the wooden shelf beside the door, where it would be safe until morning. Through the small window she could see the last light fading over the water, turning the sky from grey-blue to deep violet and then to the soft black of a cloudy night. The tide was still high, and its sound came up through the window, a gentle, constant whisper that would accompany her into sleep. The barrel sat on the dock below its canvas cover, pale in the darkness, and its stones heavy and patient. The table stood clean and bare, waiting for the next day's fish, and the knife rested on the shelf, its blade clean and its edge true, ready to begin the same quiet work when the morning fog rolled in from the Bay of Biscay. The counting of the day's work was not done with ink or quill or the scratching of numbers onto a piece of paper. It was done in the mind, quietly and without ceremony, as the hands finished their final tasks and the body prepared to leave the dock for the evening. The woman stood beside the barrel with her palm resting on the rough canvas cover, and she let her thoughts drift backward over the hours that had passed since the morning fog lifted. She did not count in the way that a merchant counts coins, stacking them into piles and tallying a sum. She simply knew in the way that a person knows how many steps they have climbed or how many breaths they have taken since waking. The barrel that sat beneath her hand was full. That was the first thing she knew, and the simplest. It had been empty when she arrived in the morning, its dark interior scrubbed clean and dry and waiting. Now it held the salted fillets of many cod, arranged in their careful layers and covered with the wooden lid and the heavy stones and the slowly rising brine. The barrel would sit on the dock for weeks or perhaps months, and then it would be opened and the fish would be taken out and soaked in fresh water and cooked into the winter meals. But for now it was full, and that was enough to know. She thought about the basket that had held the fresh fish when she arrived. It had been heavy then, its wicker handles digging into her palms as she carried it from the storage area to the table. She had lifted out one fish after another throughout the morning and the afternoon, feeling the weight of each one in her hands, before laying it on the wood and making the first cut. The basket was empty now, sitting upside down beside the wall of the net shed. She would turn it right side up in the morning, and the fisherman would fill it again with the night's catch, and the cycle would begin once more. The number of fish that had passed through her hands that day was not a precise figure that she held in her thoughts. She could have counted them if she had wanted to, perhaps 12 or 14 or 16, depending on their size and the speed of her work. But the exact number did not matter. What mattered was that the basket was empty and the barrel was full, and the work that needed to be done had been done. The tally existed in the state of the objects around her rather than in any spoken or written record. She lifted her hand from the canvas and looked at her palm. The skin was pale and wrinkled from hours of contact with salt water and fish moisture, and the fine white crystals that had worked their way into every crease and fold. She turned her hand over and looked at the back where the salt had dried in a thin crust that crackled when she flexed her fingers. The knuckles were rough and slightly reddened, and the small hairs on the back of her hand were stiff and white as if they had been dusted with flour. She rubbed her hands together, slowly feeling the gritty texture of the salt between her palms and listening to the soft sandy sound that the motion produced. The salt was in the cracks of her skin now, in the fine lines that crossed her palms and circled her knuckles and ran along the sides of her fingers. It would stay there through the evening and into the night, no matter how many times she rinsed her hands in the seawater bucket. It would only come out fully when she washed with warm fresh water and a piece of coarse soap made from ash and olive oil back in her kitchen. Even then, some small trace of it would remain, a faint white residue in the deepest creases that would not be fully gone until the next day's work began, and a fresh layer of salt replaced the old. She did not mind the salt in her skin. It was a familiar sensation, one that had been with her since she was a child, helping her mother on this same dock. The salt was a reminder of the work, and the work was a reminder of who she was and what her days were made of. It stung slightly in the small cuts and scrapes that always appeared on her hands from the occasional slip of the knife or the sharp edge of a fishbone. But the stinging was mild and brief, and it faded into the background of sensation along with the ache in her shoulders and the stiffness in her lower back. She reached down and picked up the empty salt bucket, turning it over in her hands. The inside of the bucket was coated with a fine white film that sparkled faintly in the last of the evening light. A few loose crystals rattled around the bottom, making a soft sound like tiny pebbles in a wooden bowl. She tipped the bucket and let the crystals fall into her palm, and then she tossed them into the barrel where they would join the rest of the salt and the fish and the slowly forming brine. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was thrown away that could still serve its purpose. The bucket would need to be refilled in the morning. She knew this without having to remind herself. She would walk up to the storage shed behind the house and lift the heavy wooden lid from one of the large clay jars and scoop out fresh salt until the bucket was full again. The salt in the jars came from the pans further down the coast, and it was delivered by a cart that came through the village once every few months, pulled by a patient mule with long ears and a slow, steady walk. The woman did not know the name of the man who drove the cart or the exact location of the salt pans where the crystals were harvested. She only knew that the salt appeared when it was needed, and that it was always the same grey-white color and the same coarse texture and the same sharp, clean smell. She set the bucket down beside the barrel where it would wait for morning. The clay pot that held the fish scraps was still sitting on the steps where she had left it to dry, and she walked down to retrieve it. The pot was lighter now that it was empty and dry, and she carried it easily in one hand as she climbed back up the ramp. She placed it on the ground next to the bucket so that everything was together in one place, ready for the next day's routine. The pot, the bucket, the barrel, the table, the knife, all of them waiting in their familiar positions. The walk up the stone ramp toward the village was a short one, but she took it slowly, her wooden shoes making their soft, steady clacking on the worn grey stones. The ramp had been built long ago by hands that were no longer remembered, and it had been worn smooth by generations of feet, and by the dragging of heavy barrels, and by the constant washing of the rain and the tide. The stones were uneven in places, tilted and cracked and patched with smaller stones that had been fitted into the gaps. She knew every irregularity, every place where the surface sloped a little more steeply, or where a particular stone wobbled slightly underfoot. She stepped around these places without thinking, her feet finding the smoothest path as naturally as her hands found the correct grip on the knife. The weight of her wooden shoes was a familiar thing. They were made of beechwood, carved into a simple shape that cupped the heel and supported the arch and left the toes a little room to move. The wood was dark and smooth from years of wear, and it made a solid, comforting sound with each step. The shoes were not light, but they were not heavy either. They were simply present, a steady grounding weight that connected her to the stone and the earth and the rhythm of walking. She had worn wooden shoes for as long as she could remember, and she could not imagine the feel of anything else on her feet. The street that led up from the harbour was narrow and steep, and it twisted between the whitewashed houses in a way that seemed almost accidental, as if the buildings had grown up around the path rather than the path being planned between them. The walls on either side were close enough that she could have touched both at once if she stretched out her arms, and the space between them was filled with the cool, damp air that rose from the water and settled in the shadows. Small windows looked out onto the street, their wooden shutters open to let in the evening breeze and the faint glow of candlelight or firelight from within. She passed the house of the old woman who sat on the wooden bench every day. The bench was empty now, the old woman having gone inside when the light began to fade. But the door was still slightly ajar, and a thin line of warm yellow light spilled out across the cobblestones. The woman could smell the old woman's supper, something with onions and perhaps a bit of dried fish simmering in a pot. The smell was rich and savoury, and it made her aware of her own hunger. A quiet, empty feeling that had been there all afternoon, but that she had not paid any attention to until now. Her own house was a little further up the street, tucked between two larger buildings that belonged to a fisherman's family on one side and a widow who kept goats on the other. The door was a heavy slab of dark oak with iron hinges that creaked softly when she pushed it open. The creak was a familiar sound, one that she heard every evening and every morning, and it was as much a part of her day as the sound of the knife on the cutting board. The interior of the house was dim and cool, and it smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and the faint, clean scent of wool from the blankets folded on the wooden chest in the corner. A small fire burned in the hearth, its flames low and red, and pulsing gently in the draught from the open door. The fire had been burning since morning, fed occasionally with small pieces of driftwood and the twisted roots of gorse that she gathered from the hillside. It was not a large fire, it did not need to be. It was just enough to keep the chill from the stone walls and to heat the iron pot that hung from a hook over the coals. The pot contained the remains of a stew that she had started the day before. It was a simple stew made from soaked and rinsed salt cod that had been simmering slowly with onions and a handful of dried white beans and a few leaves of wild cabbage that grew in the small garden behind the goat widow's house. The stew had been cooking for many hours, and the fish had broken down into soft flakes that thickened the broth and gave it a rich, savoury depth. The smell of it filled the small room and wrapped around her like a warm blanket. She ladled some of the stew into a wooden bowl and carried it to the small table that sat beneath the window. The table was rough and plain, made of the same dark wood as the door, and it was scarred with the marks of many meals eaten alone in the quiet of the evening. She sat down on a three-legged stool and began to eat, slowly dipping a piece of dark bread into the broth and lifting the soft flakes of fish to her mouth. The stew was warm and salty and familiar, and it tasted exactly as it had tasted the night before, and the night before that. Through the window she could see the last light fading over the harbour. The water had turned from silver to a deep soft grey, and the boats at their moorings were nothing more than dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky. A few lights had appeared in the windows of the other houses, small warm squares of yellow-orange that dotted the dark slope of the hillside. The smoke from the chimneys rose in thin columns that leaned inland with the evening breeze, their colour shifting from pale grey to a deeper charcoal as they caught the last of the light and then faded into the darkening sky. She watched the smoke for a while as she ate her spoon, moving slowly between the bowl and her mouth. The smoke was a gentle thing, soft and drifting, and it seemed to have no urgency about it. It rose from the chimneys and spread out into the evening air, where it was caught by the breeze and carried away over the hills. It was the smoke of simple fires, burning simple fuels, and it smelled of the village and the lives that were lived within its walls. When the bowl was empty, she carried it to the small stone basin that sat in the corner and rinsed it with water from a clay pitcher. The water was cool and clean, and it came from a spring that bubbled up from the rocks further up the hillside. She had carried the pitcher down that morning, filling it at the spring, as she did every morning, a small task that was as much a part of her day as the cutting of the fish. She set the bowl on a wooden rack to dry, and wiped her hands on a cloth that hung from a peg on the wall. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing coals, and she added a single piece of driftwood, watching as the flames licked up around it and began to consume it slowly. The driftwood was grey and smooth, and it had been worn into a strange twisted shape by the action of the sea. It would burn for an hour or two, giving off a soft light and a gentle warmth, and then it would crumble into ash and join the other ashes in the bottom of the hearth. She sat down on the edge of her bed and began to unlace her wooden shoes. The laces were made of thin leather strips that had been softened by years of use, and they came undone easily under her fingers. She slipped the shoes off and set them side by side on the floor beside the bed, where they would wait for morning. Her feet were bare now, and she flexed her toes, feeling the cool, smooth surface of the packed earth floor beneath them. The floor was hard and even, and it had been swept clean that morning with a broom made of heather twigs. She lay back on the bed and pulled the wool blanket up to her chin. The blanket was heavy and warm, and it smelled faintly of sheep and of the lavender that she tucked into the folds to keep away the moths. The pillow beneath her head was filled with straw that rustled softly when she moved, and it had been shaped by years of use into a shallow depression that fit the curve of her skull perfectly. Through the small window, she could see a patch of dark sky and the faint glow of the village lights reflected against the low clouds. The sound of the tide came up from the harbour, a constant gentle whisper that filled the room and blended with the soft crackle of the fire. She closed her eyes and let her thoughts drift back over the day. The barrel was full. The basket was empty. The knife was clean and resting on the shelf. The salt was in the cracks of her skin and would be there until morning. The stew had been warm and good. The smoke from the chimneys had risen and scattered. The wooden shoes sat beside the bed, ready to be laced again when the grey light of dawn crept through the window. She did not count these things as accomplishments, or measure them against some standard of what a day should be. She simply knew them as the shape of the hours that had passed, and the shape of the hours that would come. Tomorrow would be the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. The fish would arrive, and the knife would cut, and the salt would preserve, and the barrel would fill. And in the quiet spaces between these things, there would be the sound of the tide, and the cry of the gulls, and the slow, patient turning of the light from morning to evening, and back again. Her breathing slowed and deepened, and the sounds of the room faded into a soft blur. The fire crackled once and then settled. The wind brushed against the window frame, making a faint sighing sound. The tide continued its eternal whisper against the stone steps, and the woman slept, her hands resting on the wool blanket, with the salt still white in the creases of her knuckles, waiting for the morning. The darkness in the small room was not a complete darkness, because the embers in the hearth still glowed with a faint red-orange light that pulsed gently when the wind shifted outside and sent a small draught through the gaps around the door. The glow was just enough to reveal the rough shapes of things: the wooden chest against the wall, the three-legged stool pushed under the table, the pair of wooden shoes sitting side by side on the packed earth floor. The woman lay still beneath her wool blanket, her breathing slow and even, her hands resting loosely on the fabric, where the salt still traced white lines in the creases of her knuckles. The village of Lekeitio had settled into the deep quiet that came after the last cooking fires were banked, and the last candles were blown out, and the last voices murmuring behind closed doors had faded into silence. The narrow streets that twisted between the whitewashed houses were empty now, and dark except for the faint silver light that filtered down when the clouds thinned enough to let a little of the moon's glow reach the cobblestones. The cats of the village were out moving on silent paws through the shadows, pursuing the small rustling sounds of mice and the other tiny creatures that came out when the humans had gone to sleep. The cat from the dock had found a warm spot beneath an overturned boat near the net shed, and was curled into a tight ball, its grey fur blending perfectly with the grey shadows, its pale green eyes closed and peaceful. The wind had been gentle during the day, a soft breeze that came from the sea and carried the smell of salt and the distant cry of gulls. But now, in the deep hours of the night, it had freshened slightly, just enough to make itself known against the walls and the windows and the clay tiles of the roofs. It was not a storm wind. There was no howling or roaring or fierce gusts that rattled the shutters. It was simply a steady, persistent movement of air that flowed over the hills and down through the valley and out across the harbour, where it raised small ripples on the dark water and made the boats tug gently at their mooring ropes. The window in the woman's room was small and square, and it was fitted with a wooden frame that had been made by a carpenter who had lived in the village many years before she was born. The frame was made of chestnut wood that had darkened with age to a rich brown colour, and it was set into the thick stone wall with iron nails that had rusted slightly over the decades, leaving faint orange stains that bled into the surrounding whitewash. The window had no glass because glass was expensive and rare and unnecessary in a fishing village where the winters were mild and the summers were cool. Instead, it had a wooden shutter that could be closed against the rain and the wind and the cold, but on this night the shutter stood slightly ajar, held open by a small stone that the woman had placed there to let in the fresh air while she slept. The gap between the shutter and the window frame was narrow, no wider than the thickness of a thumb, but it was enough for the wind to find its way through. As the air moved across the hillside and funneled into the narrow street and pressed against the whitewashed wall of the house, a thin stream of it slipped through that gap and entered the room. The wind did not rush or bluster. It came in a steady, quiet flow that made a soft whistling sound as it passed over the edge of the wood. The sound of the wind through the window gap was a sound that had been there for 40 years. It had been there when the woman was a child, sleeping in the same room on a smaller bed with her sisters beside her, their breathing soft and synchronized in the darkness. It had been there when she was a young woman returning from the dock with her hands sore and her back aching and the smell of fish and salt in her hair. It had been there on the night her mother died, and on the night her father followed a few winters later, and on all the ordinary nights in between, when nothing of note happened and the world simply continued in its quiet, patient way. The sound had become so familiar that she no longer heard it consciously, just as she no longer heard the sound of her own heartbeat. It was a part of the texture of the night, a constant, gentle presence that wrapped around her like a second blanket. The whistle was not a pure musical note. It was a breathy, sighing sound that wavered slightly as the wind outside shifted in strength and direction. Sometimes it rose to a faint, high keying that was almost like the cry of a very distant bird, and then it fell back to a lower, softer whisper that blended with the sound of the embers settling in the hearth. The variation was slow and subtle, and it followed no pattern that could be predicted. It simply came and went, as the wind willed. The woman's sleeping mind registered these changes without waking, registering them the way the mind registers the passage of clouds across the sun on a day when the eyes are closed and the face is turned toward the sky. Beyond the sound of the wind through the window, there was the sound of the sea. The sea was always present in Lekeitio, even in the deepest hours of the night, even when the fog was so thick that the water could not be seen from the shore. The sound of the sea was not a single sound, but a layering of many sounds that blended together into a deep, continuous murmur. There was the soft lapping of the small waves against the stone steps of the dock, the sound that had accompanied the woman through every moment of her working day. There was the heavier, deeper sound of the swells breaking against the breakwater at the mouth of the harbour, a rhythmic crash and withdrawal that marked the slow pulse of the ocean. And there was the vast underlying hum of the open sea beyond the headlands, a sound so low and so constant that it was felt as much as heard, a vibration in the air and the earth that spoke of immense distances and depths beyond human reach. The woman's room was close enough to the harbour that the sound of the sea was clear and distinct, but far enough up the hill that it was softened by distance and by the intervening walls and roofs. It came to her as a gentle wash of sound, a continuous sighing presence that had no beginning and no end. It was the sound that had lulled her to sleep as an infant, and it was the sound that would accompany her into her final sleep whenever that might come. She did not think about the sea when she lay in her bed any more than a fish thinks about the water. It was simply there, the background against which all other sounds played out. The wind through the window gap and the sound of the distant sea were joined from time to time by other smaller sounds that rose briefly from the darkness and then faded away. A dog barked somewhere in the village, a single sharp sound that echoed off the stone walls and then was swallowed by the night. The dog did not bark again. It had announced whatever it needed to announce, and then it had settled back into silence. A wooden shutter somewhere down the street creaked softly as the wind nudged it against its frame, a sound like a door opening very slowly in an empty house. The creak came once and then did not repeat. The wind had moved on to press against some other surface, some other small gap in some other wall. The woman stirred slightly in her sleep, her hand moving from the blanket to rest against her cheek. The salt on her fingers brushed against her skin and she made a small sound, a soft murmur that was not quite a word and not quite a sigh. Her mind was drifting in the shallow waters between sleep and waking, a place where thoughts moved slowly and without urgency, like fish swimming through deep green bloom. In this half-dreaming state, her thoughts turned not to the distant shipyards or the great fleet being assembled across the sea, but to the small familiar things that waited for her in the morning. She saw the wooden table standing on the stone dock, its surface clean and dry and ready for the day's work. She saw the knife resting on the stone ledge, its blade dark with the stains of years of use, its handle worn smooth by the grip of her hand. She saw the salt bucket empty and waiting to be filled from the large clay jars in the storage shed. She saw the barrel with its canvas cover and its heavy stones, and the slowly rising brine that was turning the fresh cod into preserved food for the winter months. These images did not come to her as a sequence of events or a plan for the day ahead. They came as a single, quiet awareness, the knowledge that tomorrow would be the same as today, and that this sameness was not a burden, but a comfort. The knife would feel the same in her hand, and the salt would fall with the same soft hissing whisper, and the tide would come in and go out with the same patient rhythm. Nothing would change, and nothing needed to change. The world was in its proper order, and she had her place within it. The wind through the window gap rose slightly for a moment, making a sound that was almost like a voice whispering a word that could not quite be understood. The embers in the hearth flared briefly in response to the fresh air, sending a small flicker of orange light across the ceiling before settling back into their steady glow. The woman's breathing deepened and slowed, and the images of the dock and the table and the knife faded into a softer darkness. Outside the village, the hills rose dark and silent against the cloudy sky. The sheep that grazed on those hills during the day were gathered together in their folds, their woolly bodies pressed close for warmth, their breathing slow and even. The grass on the hillsides was wet with the night dew, and it bent under the pressure of the wind in long sweeping waves that moved like the surface of the sea. The wind carried the scent of the grass and the earth and the sheep down toward the village, where it mixed with the smell of the salt water and the wood smoke and the faint clean scent of the stone walls. The breakwater at the mouth of the harbour was a long arm of piled stones that curved out into the bay, sheltering the inner harbour from the force of the open ocean. The waves broke against it in a steady rhythm, rising up in a white froth that was visible even in the darkness, and then falling back with a deep resonant sound that travelled across the water and up the hillside. The sound was not loud enough to wake anyone, but it was present in the night, a deep bass note beneath the higher whisper of the wind. It had been there for as long as the breakwater had stood, and it would be there long after everyone now living in the village had been forgotten. The woman's mind drifted further from waking, and the boundary between her thoughts and her dreams became soft and indistinct. She was standing at the table on the dock, but the light was strange, a pale silver grey that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The knife was in her hand, and she was making the familiar cut behind the gills of a cod. But the fish was not a fish. It was something else, something that she could not quite see or name. The salt in her hand was warm instead of cool, and when she sprinkled it over the fillet, it fell in slow motion, each crystal hanging in the air for a moment before drifting down to rest on the pale flesh. She was not disturbed by these differences. They seemed perfectly natural in the way that dream things always do. She continued her work in the strange silver light, and the sound of the sea was all around her, not distant, but close, as if she was standing in the water itself. The wind through the window gap continued its quiet song. It had been singing this same song for 40 years, and it would sing it for 40 more if the window frame held and the shutter remained in its place. The sound was a constant in a world of constants, a small thread in the vast tapestry of the night that included the breathing of the sleeping villagers and the slow turning of the earth and the patient pull of the moon on the waters of the bay. It asked for nothing, and it promised nothing. It was simply there, a quiet companion in the darkness. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of ash, with only a few small coals still glowing beneath the grey surface. The warmth in the room was fading slowly, but the woman did not feel it because she was wrapped in her wool blanket and because her body had settled into the deep stillness of true sleep. Her breathing was so slow and so quiet that it was barely audible even in the silence of the small room. Her face was relaxed and peaceful, and the faint lines that appeared around her eyes during the day when she squinted against the bright glare off the water had smoothed away. The village slept on. The narrow streets remained empty and dark. The cats continued their silent hunting, The boats in the harbour tugged gently at their ropes with each passing swell. The tide had turned and was now beginning to ebb, drawing the water slowly away from the stone steps and exposing the barnacles to the cool night air. The barnacles closed their shells tightly and waited for the water to return. The mudflats at the bottom of the harbour were exposed again, and the small creatures that lived in the mud burrowed deeper, seeking the moisture that remained beneath the surface. The woman dreamed of the barrel standing on the dock with its canvas cover and its heavy stones. In her dream, the barrel was full and the brine had risen to cover the wooden lid completely, and the stones were partially submerged, their grey surfaces darkened by the salt water. The fish inside the barrel were transforming slowly, their flesh firming and whitening as the salt drew out the moisture and replaced it with the preserving solution. This transformation required no attention from her. It was happening on its own in the dark interior of the cask, a quiet chemical dance that had been taking place on these docks for hundreds of years. She dreamed of the morning that was still a few hours away. She dreamed of walking down the stone ramp in the grey light of dawn, with the fog rolling in from the bay and the gulls just beginning to stir on their perches. She dreamed of lifting the canvas cover from the barrel and peering inside to check the level of the brine. She dreamed of picking up the knife from the stone ledge and feeling the familiar weight of it in her hand. She dreamed of the first fish of the day laid out on the clean wooden table, its scales shining with a faint silvery slime. The wind through the window gap sighed once more, a long, soft exhale that faded into the sound of the distant sea. The embers in the hearth gave a final flicker and then settled into darkness. The woman's breathing continued slow and steady and even. The salt in the creases of her knuckles glowed faintly white in the last light from the dying coals, and the night moved on toward morning in its quiet, unhurried way, carrying the village and the harbour and the woman herself toward another day that would be exactly like the day before. The grey light of early morning crept into the small room through the gap between the shutter and the window frame, the same gap that had sung its quiet whistling song through the hours of darkness. The light was not the bright golden light of a clear sunrise, but a soft, diffuse greyness that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the sky itself had become a single pale cloud that hung low over the village and the harbour and the hills beyond. The woman opened her eyes without urgency, her body recognizing the quality of the light and understanding that it was time to rise, not because a clock had struck or a bell had rung, but because the light had reached that particular shade of grey that meant the night was over and the day was beginning. She lay still for a moment longer, feeling the warmth of the wool blanket against her chin and the familiar shape of the straw pillow beneath her head. Her hands rested on the blanket just as they had when she fell asleep, and the salt was still there in the creases of her knuckles, a fine white powder that had not washed away in the night. She flexed her fingers slowly, feeling the slight stiffness in the joints and the faint crackle of the dried salt as her skin moved. The sensation was as familiar as the grey light and the sound of the sea that still murmured up from the harbour, a constant gentle presence that had accompanied her through her dreams. She sat up and swung her feet to the cool, packed earth of the floor. Her wooden shoes sat beside the bed, where she had placed them the night before, their dark surfaces catching the faint light from the window. She reached for them and began to lace the thin leather strips around her ankles, working slowly and carefully, because there was no reason to hurry. The laces were soft and pliable from years of use, and they came through the small holes with a quiet whisper of leather against wood. When both shoes were secure, she stood and felt the familiar weight of them on her feet, grounding her to the earth and to the day that lay ahead. The hearth was cold now, a bed of grey ash with no remaining embers to stir into flame. She would build a new fire when she returned from the morning's work, but for now the chill in the room was a gentle thing, not sharp or biting, just cool enough to make her aware of the warmth she was leaving behind in the bed. She crossed to the small table beneath the window and lifted the clay pitcher, pouring a small amount of cool water into a wooden cup. The water was fresh from the spring up the hillside, and it tasted of stone and earth and the deep cold of the mountain. She drank it slowly, feeling it move down her throat and settle in her stomach, a small, clean sensation that marked the beginning of the day. Through the window she could see the harbour below. The fog had returned during the night, rolling in from the Bay of Bisque, while the village slept, and now it lay over the water like a thick grey blanket that obscured the line between sea and sky. The boats of their moorings were visible only as dark, indistinct shapes, their masts rising like thin grey lines into the thicker grey of the fog. The stone ramp that led down to the dock was wet with the moisture that the fog had deposited its surface, dark and slick, and reflecting the pale light in a dull sheen. The red tile roofs of the houses below were muted, their colour softened by the haze, until they were almost the same grey as the stone walls. The woman turned from the window and picked up her knife from the wooden shelf beside the door. The blade was clean and dark, and the handle was smooth and cool in her palm. She slipped the knife into a fold of her skirt, where it would be safe during the walk down to the dock, and she pulled her wool shawl around her shoulders against the damp of the morning air. The shawl was grey and soft, and it smelled faintly of the lavender that she kept in the chest with her blankets. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped out into the narrow street. The hinges creaked softly, the same creak they had made the night before, and the same creak they would make again this evening when she returned. The street was empty and quiet, and the fog had filled the spaces between the houses, so that the buildings on the far side were barely visible, as pale shapes looming out of the greyness. The cobblestones underfoot were wet and dark, and her wooden shoes made a soft muffled sound as she walked, their usual sharp clacking, absorbed by the moisture and the heavy air. She passed the house of the old woman who sat on the bench every day. The bench was empty now and wet with fog, and the door was closed. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, the first sign that someone inside was stirring and building up the morning fire. The woman did not pause. She continued down the street, her steps slow and steady, her eyes watching the familiar stones beneath her feet. She knew every one of them, the flat grey one that wobbled slightly near the turn, the dark one with the white vein of quartz running through its centre, the small patch of smaller stones that had been used to fill a gap where a larger stone had cracked and been removed. She stepped around the wobbling one without thinking, her feet finding the smoothest path through long habit. The tufts of grass that grew in the cracks between the stones were wet with fog, and they bent under the weight of the moisture, their green blades darkened almost to black. The grass grew wherever it could find a foothold in the narrow gaps, and the woman had been walking past these same tufts for so many years that she recognized them individually, though she had never thought to name them or count them. There was the thick tuft near the bottom of the ramp that grew in a perfect circle around a small depression in the stone, and the sparse tuft further up that never seemed to grow larger no matter how much rain fell. They were simply there, part of the path, part of the morning, part of the world she moved through. The smell of the fog was the smell of the sea concentrated and cooled, a clean, sharp saltiness mixed with the faint earthy scent of wet stone and the deeper mineral smell of the mudflats that lay exposed at the low tide. The woman breathed it in without thinking, her lungs filling with the cool, damp air that tasted of the ocean and the morning and the patient continuation of things. The fog muffled all sounds, so that the distant cry of a gull was softened into a vague mewling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and the sound of her own footsteps was reduced to a gentle padding that barely carried beyond her own ears. She reached the bottom of the ramp and stepped onto the stone dock. The wooden table stood in its place beneath the overhang of red clay tiles, its surface dark with moisture and gleaming faintly in the grey light. The barrel sat beside it, the heavy canvas cover sagging slightly under the weight of the stones and the accumulated damp of the night. The salt bucket rested upside down beside the barrel where she had left it, and a clay pot sat beside the bucket, also upside down, its unglazed surface darkened by the fog. Everything was exactly as she had left it, and exactly as she had left it, and exactly as she had known it would be. The cat was there beneath the table, curled into a tight ball, with its grey fur blending so perfectly with the grey stone that she might not have seen it if she had not known to look. Its pale green eyes were open and watching her, but it did not move except for the slow blink that was its only greeting. The woman made the soft clicking sound with her tongue, and the cat blinked again, and then closed its eyes, returning to whatever half-sleep it had been enjoying before her arrival. The cat knew the routine as well as she did, and it knew that the work would begin soon and that there would be scraps later, and that there was no reason to move until the sun burned through the fog and warmed the stones. The gulls were just beginning to stir on the roof of the net shed across the harbour. Their white bodies emerged from the fog like patches of denser greyness, and their calls were soft and tentative, the first sounds of the day rather than the raucous cries that would come later when the clay pot was emptied and the feast began. One of them lifted into the air and circled once a pale shape against the pale sky and then settled back onto the tiles, tucking its head under its wing as if deciding that the morning had not yet truly begun. The woman walked to the barrel and grasped the corner of the heavy canvas cover. The fabric was cold and damp and stiff with the salt that had crystallized in its fibers over many months of use. She lifted it carefully, folding it back upon itself to reveal the wooden lid beneath, and the 4 grey stones that sat on top of the lid, their surfaces darkened by the moisture of the night. The stones were exactly where she had placed them, and their weight pressed down on the lid, with the same patient pressure that had been there the day before and the day before that. She lifted the stones one by one and set them on the stone ramp in their familiar circle, the same circle they formed every morning. Each stone made a soft, solid sound as it settled onto the wet stone, a sound that was absorbed by the fog and did not echo. When all 4 stones were removed, she grasped the edge of the wooden lid and lifted it carefully, tilting it so that the brine that clung to its underside could drip back into the barrel. She leaned the lid against the side of the cask and looked inside. The brine had risen overnight, covering the top layer of fish completely and submerging the space where the lid had rested. The liquid was a pale amber color, clear enough that she could see the shapes of the salted fillets beneath the surface, their flesh having firmed and whitened as the salt did its slow, quiet work. The smell that rose from the barrel was the clean, sharp smell of the sea, and the salt and the faint, sweet undertone of fish beginning its transformation into preserved food. It was exactly the smell it should be, and the brine was exactly the level it should be, and the fish were exactly as they should be. She reached into the barrel and pressed down gently on the top layer of fish with her fingertips. The flesh was firm and resilient, giving slightly under pressure and then springing back. The salt had drawn out the water and replaced it with the preserving solution, and the cod was well on its way to becoming the bacalao that would feed the village through the winter. She withdrew her hand and shook the brine from her fingers, watching the droplets fall back into the barrel with small, soft sounds. The wood of the table was dry. She ran her palm over the surface, feeling the familiar grain and the slight roughness where the salt had scrubbed it clean the day before. The wood had absorbed the moisture of the night, but it had not become damp enough to need drying, and it was ready for the day's work. She reached for the bucket that sat upside down beside the barrel and turned it right side up. It was empty and clean and waiting to be filled with fresh salt from the storage shed. She walked back up the ramp a short distance to where the large wicker basket sat beneath the eaves of the net shed. The basket was full again, the fishermen having come in during the night and left their catch in its usual place. She could smell the fresh fish before she reached it, the clean, sharp scent of cod that had been swimming in the cold, deep water only hours before. The basket was heavy when she lifted it by its 2 rope handles, and the wicker creaked in the familiar way as she carried it back to the table and set it down on the stone ramp. The first fish of the new day lay on top of the pile, its silver and olive speckled skin still shining with the faint slime of the ocean. Its round eye stared at nothing, and its gills were a deep red color that spoke of a recent death. The woman looked at the fish for a moment, noting its size and the pattern of its speckles, and the small scar on its flank that marked it as distinct from all the other cod that had ever been caught. Then she reached into the basket and lifted it out, feeling the cold, firm weight of it in her hands. She laid the fish flat on the clean wooden table, with its head pointing to her left and its tail to her right. The table was cool and smooth beneath the fish, and the fog had left a faint sheen of moisture on the wood that made the scales glisten slightly in the grey light. She placed her left hand on the fish's head, pressing down to hold it steady, her fingers spread wide over the slippery surface. With her right hand, she reached for the knife that rested on the stone ledge. The handle was cool and smooth, and it fit into her palm exactly as it had fit the day before and the day before that. The weight of the blade was familiar, and the balance point was exactly where she expected it to be. She did not need to look at the knife. Her hand simply closed around it and lifted it and brought the tip of the blade to rest just behind the gill plate, at the point where the hard, bony structure of the head met the softer flesh of the body. She made the first cut, angling the blade slightly downward, so that it found the joint of the spine with a soft crunch that was more felt through the handle than heard through the air. She drew the knife along the back of the fish, from head to tail in one long, smooth motion, separating the fillet of meat from the central bone. The blade moved through the flesh with very little resistance, parting the white meat from the ribs with a quiet, wet whisper. She flicked the fish over and repeated the motion on the other side, producing a second fillet that mirrored the first. The two fillets lay side by side on the table, their flesh a translucent pearly white tinged with pink near the center where the bloodline ran. The skeleton of the fish remained attached to the head and tail, and she cut it away with another quick stroke, placing the remains into the clay pot at her feet. She scraped away the bloodline from each fillet with the edge of the knife, and then she reached for the salt. The salt bucket was empty, and she would need to fill it before she could continue. She set the knife down and walked up the ramp to the storage shed, where the large clay jars sat waiting. The jars were tall and wide, made of the same unglazed earthenware as the clay pot, and they were sealed with wooden lids held down by stones. She lifted the lid from the nearest jar and looked inside. The salt was a pale grey-white, and it sparkled faintly even in the dim light of the shed. She scooped it out with her hands and filled the bucket, feeling the familiar coarse texture of the crystals against her palms. She carried the full bucket back to the table and set it down beside the barrel. She scooped up a handful of the salt and held her hand over the first fillet, sprinkling the crystals in a slow, steady rain. The salt made its soft pattering sound as it hit the wet flesh, a sound like the first drops of rain on a dusty road. She rubbed the salts into the meat with her fingertips, working it into every crevice, and then she lifted the fillet and placed it carefully into the barrel on top of the fish from the previous day. The morning continued in this same quiet rhythm. The fog began to thin slowly as the sun climbed somewhere behind the clouds, turning from a dense grey blanket into a paler haze that let a little more light reach the surface of the water. The gulls became more active, their cries growing louder and more frequent as they sensed that the day was advancing toward the hour when the clay pot would be emptied. The cat beneath the table stretched and yawned, and then settled back into its tight curl, its pale green eyes half closed and watchful. The woman cut and salted and layered. Each fish was slightly different from the one before, and each cut required the same small adjustments of pressure and angle that her hands made without conscious direction. The salt bucket grew lighter, and the clay pot grew fuller, and the level of fish in the barrel rose slowly, one fillet at a time. The sound of the knife on the bone and the salt on the wood and the tide against the steps blended into a single quiet rhythm that asked nothing of the listener except patience. When the last fish had been cut and salted and placed into the barrel, she straightened her back and pressed her hands against her lower spine. She looked out over the harbor, where the fog had lifted enough to reveal the mouth of the bay and the dark shape of the headlands beyond. The water was a pale grey-green, and it moved with a slow, gentle swell that was barely visible from the dock. The boats had gone out again while she worked, their dark shapes having slipped away into the fog and disappeared toward the fishing grounds. She placed the wooden lid back on the barrel and lowered the stones onto it one by one. She pulled the canvas cover back into place and secured the corners with the small stones that had been waiting for her. She carried the clay pot down to the water's edge and emptied it onto the wet rocks, and the gulls descended in their flurry of white wings. She rinsed the knife and dried it on the corner of her apron and placed it back on the stone ledge. The day was different from the day before. The calendar on the wall of the village church would show a different number if anyone had thought to look at it. The fog had been slightly thicker, and the fish had been slightly larger, and the light had been slightly greyer. But in the world of salt and cod and tide, these differences were so small that they vanished into the sameness of the routine. The woman stood at the table with her hands resting on the wood, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of a task completed in the same way it had been completed the day before and would be completed the day after. She turned and began to walk up the stone ramp toward the village. The fog was lifting and the sun was beginning to break through, turning the grey light into a pale silver that sparkled on the wet stones. The cat followed a few paces behind and then veered off toward a warm patch of sun that had appeared on the ramp. The gulls settled back onto the roof of the net, shed their morning feast finished. The tide continued its slow, patient advance up the stone steps, and the woman walked on her wooden shoes, making their soft clacking sound on the familiar stones, carrying her back to her small house and her cold hearth and the simple stew that waited for the evening. Tomorrow she would wake to the same grey light and walk down the same ramp past the same tufts of grass. She would lift the same cambers from the same barrel and pick up the same knife from the same ledge. The first fish would be laid on the table and the first cuts would be made. It would be a different day, but it would also be the same day, the same quiet, unbroken continuity that had been flowing through this village for longer than anyone could remember. The ships were being built in distant yards, and the great fleet would soon set sail. But here on the dock, the salt still fell with the same soft whisper, and the tide still rose and fell with the same eternal rhythm, and the woman still stood at her table, doing the work that the day asked of her.